Alright guys, William here, back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with another review here, this time for the latest season of Australian Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, which surprisingly ends up being one of the best Australian Survivor seasons out there, which is really humorous to me considering all of the inherent issues with this season in terms of its really shoehorned in theme, its very mixed casting, its very rocky start, but this ended up being an extremely strong season, and to be honest, a lot of that comes down to George, where he once again dominates the entire screen time. And while it can be annoying to see the unevenness of the edit, I do feel like he's still made for incredible TV, where while I didn't love the first 6-ish episodes of the season, I felt like the middle stretch of the season was some of the best Survivor we've seen in years. Going from the Frasier boo all the way until around the time of the Haley boo, I thought this was all-time great Survivor, but after that we do get a slower end game, but still one that did have some interesting storylines within it. Like, I do feel like overall, Heroes vs. Villains, despite it still having the same flaws I have with Australian Survivor as a whole, ends up probably being the best season of the show up to this point. And to talk about the reasons why, I'll be running through the season from beginning to end. So with that, let's start talking about the premiere, where we get the typical over-the-top Australian Survivor intro, introducing us to the theme of Heroes vs. Villains, which is still so ridiculous that this is a thing that they did, that they decided to do a half returnee season, instantly labeling newbies as heroes or villains, while also not even getting half returnees. You could only get 11. Like, it really feels like they really want to do an all-star season so bad, but they just could not get the people and decided, screw it, let's do it anyway. And considering the near purpling of the newbies moving forward, I mean, you can really look at a lot of the season as just a returnee season anyway. But first we get introduced to some of the heroes, including Sean and obviously Haley, where she already gets talk about wanting to make history by winning again, and talks about how she's the only one to be able to take out George, which is, I guess, he took him to the end, but whatever. We also get introduced to Rogue, who gets really propped up in this opening scene as a true hero, someone that has fought for what is right, which is funny considering the rest of her run on this season. We also see Sam Webb, whose first word out of his mouth is mateship, which I guess sounds about right. Though also here he talks about wanting to play the exact same like he did in season 1, which it's like, okay, I guess. To be fair to him, he did make it pretty far his first time around, but you definitely would have expected him to at least have a bit more of a cutthroat nature this time. We also see Nina, who gets a really strong intro here, despite being purpled for the rest of the pre-merge, of her talking about how she's a hero raised by a villain, and that this is going to be her season. And it really felt like Nina was being set up for a big edit, only for her to just not get that. We also get introduced to Flick, who talks about her mom's death once again, which really, that's most of her personal content on this season, as moving forward she's another one that gets largely purpled in comparison to the other vets. But then we move on to the villains, where here we first see Jordy, who obviously was going to return for this season after being this massive figure the last time around. We see the return of Shawnee, who becomes the first 3-time player, and she ends up having a really fun intro here, talking about how she's back because inflation is a bitch, and we have her lounging in a pool, and I thought that was a fun way to introduce her to the show. We get introduced to Anjali, who obviously ends up being the first boot, but she ends up having a really fun energy here, having some great confessionals. But also along the way, we get some really bizarre B-roll that was just so hilarious to me, of the villain sitting in a truck, and we see Jackie and Simon having to run up to the truck and jump into it, which was just ridiculous. And then we also see Frasier just standing around with some local Samoans for some reason, and he fist bumps them as he gets on the truck, which is funny. And Frasier's intro here is also just kind of funny, where he says, "Why am I a villain? Because I'm a real estate agent," which is like, I guess that's a thing. But either way, obviously this all leads up to the introduction to George, who is obviously the massive star of the season, as he will be on any season he's on. Though again, funny that he really plays up this rivalry with Haley here, despite the fact that they end up clearly working together, even by the end of this first week. But also we get a couple shorter intros before the challenge, where we see Jerry get an intro talking about how he's a hero because he puts people before himself, which right away he came off as so boring to me, but I will say I did kind of like Jerry as the season progressed. And also we get an intro to Sarah, who talks about how she's known for pushing Miss Grease, and says that if she actually did push her, she wouldn't have gotten up, which they end up using this confessional twice, which considering she barely gets any confessionals on this season. It is funny that this is pretty much all of her content on the show. But again, we get to the challenge, which was pretty mundane, just a challenge of them having supplies scattered around the course. The one that wins the challenge gets all the supplies that they take to the end, which again feels similar to challenges we've seen in the past. Particularly something like a Survivor Palau. I remember they used this. Pretty standard stuff, but also very obvious that the heroes are going to win this, considering how blatantly more physical they are than the villains, which I will say just the overall balancing of these tribes was very off, where the heroes just had so many more clearly athletic people on that tribe, while the villains, like, you can tell that they put the likes of like a Simon and a Liz on the villains to try to boost their physicality, but it really still seemed extremely lopsided. By the way, this ends up leading to the camp life, where, I mean, let's just talk about the heroes first, because straight up, the heroes don't get that much content in this premiere, and also just across this entire premiere week, where it really felt like the villains were really stealing the show. And to be fair, the villains were the more interesting tribe. This definitely did neuter the fact that one of the heroes could potentially win at the end. But again, right away, we get solid content from Matt, where he has the first confessional as they enter the camp, talking about how excited he is to be there, and ends up talking about how he feels like a small fish and how this is a great tribe. And we also get other people talking about how great Matt is. And again, all of this felt like very strong content for Matt, where I did think of him as a potential winner pick after this first episode, though he ends up just being kind of purple for most of the rest of the pre-emerge, which obviously took that notion away by the end of it. We also got a lot of focus around Haley here, with her talking about the winner's curse, that no winner has ever made it past their first tribal council, which, I mean, okay. I mean, yeah, again, this is a trend on Australian Survivor where there's been 2 winners that have come back in the past, both on All Stars. It's like, again, this is not really a curse, especially when, like, we're taking Survivor from a more global perspective. Like, this definitely is not really a thing, but again, they really need to hype this up on the show. But here we do also get introduced to Rogue, which initially comes off pretty fun, where we see her having to be told that Haley is a winner, and she's shocked at that. We get her talking to Jerry, where Jerry says that he's closer to death than her, to which she says, no, I have almost died 3 times. Talks about how a lion has bit her ass, and she asks Sean if he's circumcised. And again, like, all of this is really funny. Like, she initially came off as this like Debbie / coach style figure, but then we get into the more icky stuff, where we do get to her talk with Nina, which initially has Rogue being really dismissive of her, where Nina tries to tell her where North Carolina is, and Rogue says, you don't have to explain it to me like I'm an idiot. But then we get to the more controversial line, the line of her saying that I'm more African American than you, and you need to understand that, which is just such an idiotic thing to say. And to me, moving forward, this kind of paints this more like icky taint onto Rogue moving forward in the season, to where, like, I didn't find her as fun because of how much negativity started to surround her. But again, here we do focus a lot more on the villains tribe here, where instantly we see Simon taking charge of the tribe, and he gets his intro talking about how he needs to keep his ego in check, and for some reason blames George for his loss last season, which, like, why? Again, like, this felt like another storyline that was just hammed up for the show, where, again, George had nothing to do with Simon's elimination last time. Well, Haley did, and we do see him with Haley later on the season, to where nothing is mentioned from that, which again makes this entirely ridiculous. But obviously the Simon versus George rivalry ends up being this massive storyline across the season. But here we do also obviously focus on George, to where we instantly see him creating some relationships. We see him right away talking with Shawnee. That's an alliance that doesn't really form right away. Instead, we see George forming an alliance with Anjali and Jackie, with him calling them his 2 Karas, which was kind of funny. But the Jackie relationship here in particular is pretty interesting to me, considering this was a pregame relationship where they had played poker together before the show. I do think this would have been an interesting alliance to see how they would have played this moving forward, had obviously this disaster scenario not occurred. But also here we do eventually get introduced to Michael, who really comes off as playing way too hard, way too fast, and how we really just see him running around, going to every person, telling them that he wants to target George. And to be fair, based on how the show is portraying it, it does seem like he's somewhat effective for this first round, to where it does seem like there was at least a lot of talk about taking out George right away. But really, Michael just came off as a type of player that would be an early boot. But eventually this leads to the immunity challenge, a pretty mundane one on paper, though there is this one aspect of the challenge that is just idiotic, where they have them jumping over these blocks to which they have to flip over them and land in a pool of water, more than likely face first, in a situation where the pool of water is extremely shallow, which it's like, how did this get past health and safety? Like, how did anyone approve this challenge? And obviously this is where we do see both George and Jackie both end up injuring themselves when falling in. We see George instantly bleeding from the head. We see Jackie being able to move. And this is all really incompetent of production to think that this was actually a challenge that was doable. Well, again, like, if there was a bigger pool of water, I can excuse this, but like the fact that there's like not is just even more idiotic. But this obviously leads to George and Jackie getting taken out of the game to be assessed. But again, we get the strategizing back at camp, where this is where Shawnee starts to get a lot of content, where we see her bond with Liz, which obviously becomes a powerful alliance moving forward in the season. And we do see Shawnee wanting to work with George, where she talks about using him as a shield and ends up turning votes away from him and instead onto Jackie in the case that they come back. Though if they don't, obviously Anjali becomes the target as the person close to George that isn't there. And I mean, I will say Anjali does largely get screwed over in the vote here. Again, her two closest allies both get taken out of the game, both of which were bigger targets than her, though obviously she ends up having a misread by the end. I don't think that takes away from the fact that, yeah, she does get put in this position because of really unlucky circumstances. But here we do see Stevie also being brought up as a secondary target, and Stevie ends up getting a decent amount of content here as well, though this time really focusing around his rivalry with Shawnee, which is mostly a one-sided rivalry. Either way, I will say I do feel like this section of the episode did kind of drag for a while, where again we spent a lot of time on Steve and his awkward interactions with Shawnee. We spent a lot of time on Anjali thinking that she knows where the votes are going, but not really. We get a lot of content on Shawnee being worried that the vote's on her, which is like it never really seemed to be. So again, I felt like a lot of this was a lot of wasted time. But this brings us to Tribal, where we do get the reveal that Jackie has officially been medevaced from the game, while George will be kept overnight. Which, I mean, again, George obviously got really injured here, but also does kind of scream out to me of like, did they want to keep George safe for this episode? But either way, we do get a bit of a twist here in that because Jackie had already been medevaced, the Villains Tribe are now given the choice on whether or not to vote someone out. Which, why? Why are you going to vote someone out? Where again, they already have a massive disadvantage to the heroes, and for you to actively take out one of your numbers when you don't have to is just kind of idiotic. But they do it for some reason, and again, this was just so stupid to me. And the fact that like not a single person really came up as a voice of dissension to this is really funny. Especially considering obviously Anjali is one of the big proponents of voting someone out here in a situation where she gets voted out. Well, then let's talk about the two boots here. I guess we'll start off with Jackie, who again, obviously just was not on the show, and I really feel for her, as I do feel like she's someone that had potential in the game. She seemed to have a decent strategic mind back her first time around, though just had no social capital in that season, and I really felt like this could have been the season for her being on a tribe with villains, but obviously she gets medevaced, and it's just a really terrible way for her to go, and I do hope she gets another chance at some point down the road, considering she seems like a massive fan. And then we got Anjali, who, again, I thought Anjali was actually a pretty fun presence on the show. I thought she had great confessionals. I thought she just had this fun energy and really playing up this hero versus villain dynamic, but at the same time, never felt like she was poised to do that well in the game. I mean, while I could have seen like this potential for her being this like Chrissy style figure from Blood versus Water, I felt like more times than not, she did feel like an earlier boot, and here she's obviously the first boot, though in a position where she kind of gets screwed over due to her other allies being taken out of the game. Now for episode 2, where we get very little content from the Heroes Tribe once again. We literally only get 2 segments, one of them being immediately after the eventual tribe raid, which didn't really have much substance to it. The only one of substance here did have a couple intros to players that weren't present in episode 1. We do see Shawnee for the first time, who has a solid intro here, talking about wanting to be the real her while out there, despite being an actress. And I did feel like if this was episode 1, I would have thought of her as a top contender, though the fact that they relegated episode 2, and then also how self-righteous she comes off the rest of the season, it didn't really seem like that much of a winner edit. And then we also get an introduction to Paige, who I just found largely grating on this season. I never really found her that likable, though they try to give her a positive introduction here through her leading the shelter building. But a lot of the focus does end up going to the Villains Tribe, where right away we see George coming back to camp with this massive scar on his face, which was kind of funny in the sense that you could tell just how hard they were trying to bring George back into the game here. They allowed him to come back with that open of a wound there. But obviously all of this just continues to set up this George versus Simon rivalry, with Simon being annoyed at how the other tribe members are christening him, which was so weird. But beyond that, we do also see Michael wanting to target George, and we see this massive one-sided rivalry between Michael and George across this episode, which was just kind of humorous to see. But this is also where we do get the first of these really awkward conversations between George and Simon, where really both of them come off as extremely passive-aggressive, taking like little shots at each other. And really throughout the season, obviously the edit seems to side with George over Simon in these moments. Though I will say, I also do feel like George is really egging people on as well. Like, I think the thing about George is that he is a master at actively getting on people's nerves and knowing that he gets on people's nerves to the point where they retaliate. At the point that they retaliate, he's able to play it up as if he doesn't get why they're retaliating at him, which I think is, again, solid gameplay from George. I do respect this aspect of George as a game player, but it can be really annoying as a presence to live with. But this eventually leads to Shaunie and Liz now deciding to work with George, adding them to their alliance, to which it later gets called the Spice Girls Alliance, which ends up being one of the more fun alliances we see across the season. But also, this is where Liz gets her intro, which really ends up being her only confessional in the early portions of this season, of her, with her talking about being an Olympian. And it's a pretty baseline confessional, but it's like, despite the fact that she gets almost no confessionals during early portions of this season, she is constantly present, which was always this perplexing thing to me of like, is this enough for a potential winner edit? Where like Australian Survivor obviously has these big, bolsterous winner edits where they make it very obvious from the very beginning. But with Liz, it feels like she's getting content on the show, but just never being able to voice her actual opinion on things, which made me a bit unsure of how to assess her. By the way, this leads up to the reward challenge, which ends up being a really physical one, though here we get the first time that the villains outsmart the heroes, leading up to one of the humorous matchups of Sean versus Steve. Also, we see Simon barely winning his round by swinging his feet across the line, which technically counts. Also, Simon in the early portion of the season was pretty fun to see him embracing this more villainous side of him, where then back to that first challenge, he ends up stealing things from the heroes pile. And it's like, well, this is technically bad gameplay in the sense that this is potentially pissing off the heroes for down the road. I did find this to be a fun aspect of Simon's early days on the season, but the villains do win this challenge here, and through that they win a tribe raid. And I will say straight up, this felt so manufactured for the villains. Like, obviously the villains are going to win a tribe raid. It's like, do you really expect the heroes to win it? And obviously the villains end up hamming this up as much as possible. With George talks about how he wants to leave them a message and wants to leave them with no dignity. And we even see George try to cut down their shelter only for the rest of the tribe to tell him to stop, which was all pretty funny. But here Mimi starts to get some content on the show, with her fighting against her tribe here, in that she wants to leave some things behind for them while everyone else wants to take everything from them. Which, considering Mimi is the boot for the following episode, I will say I did like this kind of trend on this season, although I'm at points introducing figures that get booted in following episodes in the episode beforehand. I felt like they at least gave Mimi her due here. But this leads to the immunity challenge, where it ends up being a pretty boring one, though. This is where Sean ends up rolling the ball all by himself, which really gets hyped up in all the promos. But obviously the heroes end up winning once again here, and here we continue to see George being targeted by Michael and Simon. But Michael ends up playing extremely hard during this round, where everyone else starts to get sketched out by him, to the point where obviously the votes end up turning against him. Again, kind of standard of what you would expect from Michael's arc on this season. But again, the episode as a whole is just kind of strange, where again, we still focus so much on this George plan as if it's actually a reality, with Simon trying to gather votes together to take him out, though to me it just never felt like it was actually going to happen. It felt pretty obvious that Michael was going to be the boot here, leading us to Tribal, where we do get a pretty explosive one here, with Michael really making a splash on his way out, with everyone being clearly annoyed with him, where George asks him, "What did I do to you?" And really the entire tribe's like laughing as George is calling him out, which it just shows you how disliked Michael clearly was at this point. But again, we get to the vote, where we do interestingly see George putting a split vote onto Stevie, in the case of an idol. So again, good play on him, but Michael just gets blindsided here. And I mean, Michael just felt so primed to be an early boot here. He really just felt like this David Samson-esque figure of this guy who plays the game way too hard right away. Now, Michael at least survived the single tribal, so at least there's that, but just everyone seemed to hate him. And he really just seemed to get on everyone's nerves to where I do think he is just genuinely a bad player. Even though he did make for some pretty good TV, and he actually ends up being the most overexposed newbie during the early portions of this season, so I mean, at least there's that. But now for episode 3, where once again, the villains get most of the screen time here, where really the only segment for the heroes comes immediately after losing the reward challenge, which I will say the reward challenge itself was pretty fun, where again we get another Stevie versus Sean matchup. We get this little humorous moment for me of JLP seeming to forget Jordy's name and just continuously call him Joker. But either way, the villains win once again here, outsmarting the heroes. But really the only content for the heroes here ends up being the setup of this meat tray alliance, where Ben gets his first confessional on the season. This ends up being kind of a weird one where it's just objectifying all the men. But either way, again, more focus on the villains here, where the cold open to this episode is bizarre to me in the fact that it's literally just a segment about Sarah, where Sarah gets her intro, which is the same intro that we had in episode 1. And she ends up having a pretty fun energy in the confessional here, despite the fact that she's invisible from this point on, which makes you question, why was this here? But either way, after winning the reward, we do end up having the players getting cookies, which supposedly had coconut in it, which sounds terrible. I don't know why they would want that on Survivor, but this ends up leading to the obvious idol hunt, with people expecting an idol to be in play now, to which we see George find one, with him explicitly saying that he knows it's real because it has a note, which might play a factor. But again, we get so much talk about how people think that there is an advantage in the cookie jar, leading to nighttime, where Mimi decides to go and secretly dig into the cookies in the middle of the night, during which we have Liz creepily staring at her from behind, which obviously means that Mimi has gotten caught here. And the next morning, the target seems to instantly be put on Mimi for doing this, which is, again, really bad play from Mimi, as this fully just puts a target on her back. Obviously, the villains end up losing the immunity challenge once again, during which we have a couple fun moments from like Stevie eating cookies in front of the heroes. And also, interestingly, again, George going to Haley and telling her where the idol is, which again, despite this rivalry being set up between the two, they obviously clearly had a pregame alliance together here. But this now makes the villains the losingest tribe in Australian Survivor history, as they are the first tribe ever to lose the first 3 immunity challenges in a row. And right away, the vote seems to be between Mimi and Stevie, with Shani wanting Stevie out. And we also do see George wanting to keep Mimi around, saying that she could be a potential ally for him, which I will say all this makes the later switch in the vote pretty confusing. But this is where we do get the big storyline that starts in this episode, where we get the reveal that there is something in the cookie jar, something that Simon ends up finding, and he instantly thinks that he has an idol, despite the fact that there is no note in sight. And he really ends up going on a power trip here with this idol, thinking that he has all the power now. And again, this is not an idol. Like, I don't even know why he thought this was an idol. As again, like, why is just this random thing in the jar just instantly going to be an idol without any other indication that it is? Now, I will say it is dumb what this thing ends up being, and that it being a clue to an idol that has this emblem painted on it, which is like, wouldn't you just know that that coconut is containing an idol just from the fact that there's a painting on it to begin with? I mean, this is not a clue. This is simply just a random thing they put in the jar, which supposedly sources say that this was not intended to be this like fake out for the players, that they actually thought this was a genuine clue, which is like stupid. Like, this is idiotic for you to actually think that this is a genuine clue. And again, it feels so much more like production just planting a fake idol because they knew it was going to be good TV. And again, supposedly that's not the case, which either way, I feel like this is bad on production. It's either bad in the sense that, yeah, they planted a fake idol, which adds to the manufactured nature of some of these storylines, or they just did a terrible job at making a clue for an idol. But either way, with this idol now, Simon now shows Jordy the idol and now wants to take out George by idling him out of the game, talking about how this is his redemption, which again, I don't get how. I get the aspect of, okay, you playing an idol successfully, but like all this just felt very ridiculous to me, and this is terrible gameplay from Simon. Now, I do think Simon getting rid of George is not bad. It's probably a benefit to his game for sure. It's just the fact that he's literally going to betray the entire tribe to play what he thinks is an idol to take George out is just really ridiculous. To the point where we get the tribal, and we do have a fun tribal here because there is a lot of whispering going around because Simon clearly wants to go through this plan, though no one else is on board with it. Though something that does change here is that we do see Mimi getting really defensive at tribal, which leads to Shawnee changing her mind and wanting Mimi out, which it leads to a unanimous Mimi vote somehow, which again, I don't get why. Why this makes Shawnee and Liz decide to change their mind, which one, it shows great positioning from them in the fact that they were able to flip the vote in an instant here, but also Mimi is for sure a better ally for them down the road than Stevie, who is much more aligned with the Simons of the world. So I really do question why this was the case that they decided to flip here, but either way, unanimous Mimi vote, though at the end of the episode we do get this big moment of Simon taking out George's hat and throws it in the fire. Again, fun TV moment, technically against the rules as you're not supposed to take other people's belongings. Again, this is a thing we saw even in the original Heroes vs. Villains of Sandra burning Russell's hat and no one had an issue then, so it's like, who really cares? By the way, we lose Mimi, who again I thought was a fun presence for the time that she was there. I think she played pretty suboptimally while she was there and seemed to not really have any solid allies, though she did have some fun moments. Again, her digging through the cookie jar is fun, her fighting against her tribe during the tribe raid is fun. Like, she was a decent character on this season, though one that I expect to be pretty forgettable down the road. Now for episode 4, where this kind of ends up being the antithesis to the earlier episodes, where we get almost nothing from the villains, but we get so much focus on the heroes, with the heroes just not being as interesting. But really the only villain sequence here this entire episode ends up being the opening sequence, which just ends up being the fallout of Simon throwing George's hat in the fire, which leads to George not caring. So that was underwhelming. But following this, again, so much focus on the heroes tribe, initially with Jerry being injured, and through that makes him being talked about as a liability. Though we do see Sharni talking about how much she loves Jerry, which ends up being a lot of Sharni's content on this season. But also we continue to see Rogue being the target because obviously, and through that Haley now talks about wanting to throw the immunity challenge to get rid of Rogue, which I think is extremely idiotic. As again, in this situation where Haley is potentially a target and she is a former winner, and also just in general looked at as a massive threat, for you to want to throw the immunity challenge just initially is bad just because you could potentially go home, but even if you don't, you're lessening your numbers for no real reason. It's like, yes, Rogue is such a wild card that you never know what she's gonna do, but to me, having Rogue around still, again, keeps the attention off of you, but also is probably a number that is gonna stick by the heroes after merged and go to the villains. So I really just feel like this is all pretty bad, but here we do get a pretty boring reward challenge of it being like the football style challenge, which just has David winning for his tribe because he's the former AFL player, and they end up winning pizzas, which they find out are frozen pizzas, and this is so stupid. Again, I hate that Australian Survivor does this. I mean, it is kind of humorous in how pathetic the reward is, but also it's just kind of sad to see them being given frozen pizzas. Through all this, we do see David finding something, to which he hands it off to Sam, and Sam is confused over what it is because that's Sam for you. This leads to the guys going on an idol hunt, to which we do see Sean finding the idol and decides to not tell his alliance about it, really hyping up Sean here as this hero who's going to play like a villain, which I thought was pretty good content for him and definitely upped his winning chances to me. But again, we got to the immunity challenge, that being an endurance comp where the last team to have less than 2 players remaining ends up winning. And here we do see Haley and Sharni being the only 2 left for the heroes, to which Haley decides to drop out in a really obvious way, as this is a challenge that is so obviously primed for Haley to win, considering her being really a master at endurance comps, yet she throws it here. And while again, this does end up leading to the eventual Rogue boot, I do think this was a very risky play from her point of view for really no real benefit to her. But here you see Haley doing a lot of the legwork and her trying to split the vote between Rogue and Jerry and trying to keep herself out of the talks here, though this ends up leading to Sean recognizing what she's doing to talk about potentially taking out Haley, though that obviously doesn't go through. And we do get a pretty interesting tribal here, despite the fact that it was was so obvious that Rogue was going home. We do get Rogue calling out the heroes for not truly being heroes, saying that only herself, Jerry, and Matt are true heroes. And really this ends up leading to the entire tribe just fighting with Rogue on her way out, which is just humorous. Where we especially see a lot of animosity between Rogue and Paige that never gets really propped up on their show, though this is clearly due to their differing beliefs on animal cruelty. And again, while I do think Rogue is definitely a negative presence on this season, I will also say don't like Paige either. And I feel like that's probably like the only thing Rogue got right on this season. But either way, easy Rogue vote here. And again, Rogue is someone that should have been such a fantastic character. She is someone that is such a wild card. She's someone that really just says whatever is on her mind, and that leads to a bevy of ridiculous moments in her very short run here. Though again, it also leads to a bit of ickiness in terms of her treatment of Nina, though I do think out of the earlier boots on this season, she is certainly one of the more notable ones. And I mentioned this before, and I still stick by this at this point, that I do think Rogue is probably the worst player survivor I've ever seen. Where again, for a while I've been saying Wendy Jo, but I do feel like Rogue is essentially a worse version of Wendy Jo. Rogue is essentially a version of Wendy Jo that has no passivity to her, or at least Wendy Jo knew that she was going to be so annoying to everyone else that she decided to just not talk to anyone. Rogue doesn't even have that filter to her. She's just genuinely this very unlikable presence, and one that annoys the entire tribe, and one that seems to be hated by the entire tribe. So I think for me, I would actually say that Rogue might be the worst player survivor I've ever seen. But now for episode 5, which ends up being structured similarly to the previous episode, where we do get first 2 scenes on the villains tribe, while the rest of the episode ends up being on the heroes tribe. But this ends up providing some really great content for Geordi, where to me this is where Geordi's edit started to really pop and made him seem like a potential winner, though that obviously wasn't the case. But we first get to see his relationship with Frasier, with them seeming to become a duo, while we also see Geordi going and making a deal with George, where we have Geordi recognizing that Simon is rubbing the tribe the wrong way and decides to make this deal to keep George around, working both sides. And again, this was a big surprise for me from Geordi, where straight up coming into the season, I was very much expecting Geordi to be this Simon figure for George, to be the one that was combating with him throughout the season, but he ends up actually playing this season much better than I expected. And while this relationship with George obviously doesn't play out to his favor, it is something that I was kind of surprised to see him end up doing here. But again, with that, the rest of the episode ends up focusing on the heroes, where we start that off with Haley talking about how the winner's curse is gone because it was definitely there to begin with. But this ends up leading to Ben finally getting content and him getting his background segment and wanting to pull the tribe together by making a fake idol that the tribe can use together against the villains, which ends up instead putting a target on his back. Because obviously, I mean, this is just kind of stupid in my eyes. And while like Ben is definitely well intentioned here, I feel like this is just a move that is never going to work. Where if you're someone like Ben who's not really ingrained within the majority alliance, you showing them that you're thinking about the game enough to want to make a fake idol to use, while again it isn't actually bad in the sense that like what are you going to do with that where everyone knows it's a fake idol? Like obviously you're not going to use it against them, but again, with the way that most people think out there in the game of Survivor, this is just going to make them think that you're more sketchy because you're even thinking about this sort of thing. So again, to me, I thought this was just really bad gameplay from Ben, even though a more logical perspective of it is that yeah, he is trying to use this for the greater good of the hero. But this ends up leading to Sam getting his typical Sam content about how Ben is shifty. And again, this very much felt like a repeat of the Nick content from season 1 of him just being so gung-ho on targeting a single person because they're trying to play the game. But once again, we do get fun content from Sean here and him telling the guys go look for an idol when he obviously knows that he has it. So that's funny. This leads to a reward challenge that has some fun content from the villains congratulating the heroes for voting out Rogue, which made it seem pretty clear that just everyone hated Rogue, even from the opposite tribe. But the reward here ends up being a trip to the bakery, to which the heroes end up winning once again here, and this ends up leading to a pretty interesting reward. I always like this reward. This is something that they used to do back in the days of Survivor All-Stars and Survivor Guatemala, where Sam, who ends up being the one to pick up the note, ends up being the person that has to divvy out each of the rewards here, where there is a lineup of all the different foods and he gets to pick who gets what. And I do like this social strategy aspect being added to the reward here, even though to be honest, I didn't know what like half these foods were. But here back at camp again, we get more content about Sean now deciding to make a secret deal with Haley and wanting to use her as a shield moving forward, and uses her as a scapegoat to tell the others that she has the idol, which I think all this was pretty fun play from Sean, and definitely was a bit of a surprise based on how I felt like he was going to play coming into it. But again, we get to the immunity challenge, pretty easy win for the villains, and it being a fire making challenge, and Stevie making the fire right away. But in the lead up to the vote here, it really ends up becoming between Ben and Jerry, where Jerry is obviously injured. However, Ben is looked at as this shifty figure in the game, and while there is another talk about potentially taking out Haley, again, it once again doesn't go through. And really, none of this actually matters anyway, as when we get to Tribal, we get the reveal that tonight's a little different in the fact that instead of voting someone out of the game, they're voting someone out to go to the other tribe, which, again, we've seen before. But we do get some intrigue here from Paige actually volunteering and wanting to go to the other side, though everyone doesn't agree with her plan, and Sam, in his infinite wisdom, ends up saying that he wants to send someone that we're willing to lose, which is just idiotic to say, clearly telling them that they're on the bottom. But here, they end up switching the vote off of Ben, who did seem like the initial target, and instead voting out Jerry here instead, which again I do think is the right call. Again, it's someone that is expendable. It's someone that will also weaken the other tribe considering his injury. And overall, I do think this is actually pretty solid play, though obviously the way that Sam says it is pretty bad. And while again, it doesn't work out in their favor because of how clearly Jerry is on the bottom, I don't think it's actually a bad move here to do so. By the way, we move on to episode 6, where we obviously get Jerry's arrival at the villains tribe, which is really awkward with him just jumping into the shelter and just like quietly introducing himself, which is funny. But this ends up leading to this fun dynamic between Simon and George, where George wants to sleep next to Jerry and Simon gets annoyed. Again, all this is pretty fun. Again, obviously them fighting for Jerry's vote at this point. And really this ends up leading to Jerry being more welcome with the villains than he was with the heroes, where obviously now he's looked at as this very important number, this swing vote. And this also leads to this big introduction for Jerry of him getting sympathetic content, talking about losing his son and how his business was destroyed by COVID. And all this was pretty good content to where I definitely did look at Jerry as a potential winner after this episode, even though it did come off as very circumstantial. Now, the Heroes Tribe doesn't get that much content in this episode, with most of it just pertaining to Sharni being annoyed that Jerry was voted out, and then also them winning the reward, during which we have Haley telling George to work with Jerry, which is interesting, which obviously ends up motivating George to scoop him up moving forward. But this leads to the heroes getting lasagna, during which they get photos from home, which, yay, I guess. I mean, nothing too notable here. But again, rest of the episode focuses on the villains, where we see George putting in very good work in pulling Jerry over to his side, after they lose the immunity challenge, which ends up being one that's extremely hyped up as the closest finish in Australian Survivor history. And I will say it actually was a pretty fun conclusion, with the heroes knowing the puzzle, but the villains copying off their puzzle and only missing it out by a second, and that was kind of fun. But again, this leads to George seemingly winning the battle for Jerry's vote, but even then, it isn't an outright majority here. And I will say the overall lead up to the vote off here is very strange, where I feel like we're certainly missing out on a lot, where obviously this ends up leading to a Sarah vote off somehow, despite the fact that Sarah gets no confessionals here. And also more of the focus is again between George and Simon and them trying to pick up Jerry. Though along the way we do see George finds out that Sarah has turned against him and decides to try to target her instead. And again, a lot of the explanation for this vote isn't properly shown, where clearly this was a consensus vote. Clearly this was a situation where Sarah got caught playing the middle, no one really trusted her, and they voted out because of that. However, none of that is properly explained on the show, as we really don't even get Simon's point of view in this, to where instead we see George trying to flip over Stevie to try to get him to vote on Sarah, but based on what we see, it seems like Stevie was the most apprehensive to vote for Sarah out of everyone. So again, just feels very strange how all this was portrayed, but again, it does lead up to the Sarah vote. And again, Sarah was barely on the show. I mean, her only content is literally her introductions. She got 2 intros on this season for some reason, and that's literally the only time she got confessionals. And I think Sarah could have been this very fun villain on the show. Again, the confessionals that she had were pretty fun. It's just that she wasn't shown on the show, and because of that, I feel like I know very little about her, outside the fact that she didn't push Miss Grease down the stairs, and because that ends up leading to his vote off being kind of just unsatisfying in my eyes. Now for episode episode 7, and I mean, this is obviously now going to go down in history as one of the greatest episodes of all time, though through that ends up being a very strangely structured one, where over half of the episode ends up taking place at Tribal, leading to an extremely rushed beginning part of the episode. I mean, the heroes, again, barely get any content here. Really, the only content that they have is talk about them wanting Jerry to come back, and we cut to the villains tribe, where Jerry seems to be in this really great position, now fully in the middle of two sides, and fully ingratiating himself within the Spice Girls, with them calling him Old Spice, and Liz even getting content talking about how much she loves Jerry, which, again, it seems like Jerry really thrived on the villains tribe, which makes the decision later on really strange in that he decides to flip back to the heroes when given the opportunity, which I will say, very questionable move. I mean, Jerry's clearly on the bottom of the opposite tribe, and I think he was very lucky that he doesn't get voted out in that situation. I think overall that was a bad move, though one that doesn't end up harming him too much in the game, and does still allow him to be looked at as this loyal figure that actually ends up probably booning his game by the time of the swap. But here, the immunity challenge isn't really close. Clearly, heroes were going to win. Again, the rest of the time obviously is spent on the villains, where, again, we get more of the George versus Simon rivalry, as you would expect, where more awkwardness between them at camp, to the point where Jordy has finally decided that now is the time for him to flip on Simon. And Jordy's flip against Simon here is a move that I'm kind of conflicted on. I mean, obviously Simon is a very close ally to him, someone that I do think will be loyal to Jordy moving down the road, especially more so than George in particular. But I do get the sentiment of wanting Simon out, as obviously Simon's rubbing the entire tribe the wrong way, and is someone that is such a clear target for the Spice Girls side of things. And Jordy seems to have a great relationship with Liz and Shawnee, to where I do think they genuinely want to take Jordy far into the game. So I can get why he would take out Simon here. I do think if it was me personally, I would not. I think I would go for George, especially split up this trio that seems to be very close, and that way it also isolates Shawnee and Liz. But I can understand why he decides to flip here, especially to create more tribe unity by the time of the swap. But again, coming into Tribal, it seemed like a very clear Simon blindside. This gives us to what was declared as the best Tribal ever coming into the episode, and to be fair, it lived up to those expectations. It was a very, very strong Tribal. Again, one that takes up over half the episode. One that just really felt like this epic tale that continued to go on and on. There felt like this massive series of events that really led to incredible TV here. Though again, a smidge manufactured, as we will talk about. Though it all starts with this initial bickering between George and Simon, which again, the edit ends up painting Simon in a really bad light here. And while again, Simon is bad here, I do think it kind of minimizes how passive aggressive George is being during this conversation as well. But this leads up to the reveal that tonight is something different, as everyone will now be given a chance to win individual immunity for some reason. And again, this is the part that to me feels a bit manufactured. This was a situation that obviously has Simon end up winning immunity, which leads to all the craziness that happens afterwards, though this is obviously a thing that doesn't happen on most tribal councils. Now, straight up, I do not think this was rigged. I don't think this was something that they brought in at the last second. I mean, I think this is clearly something that they had planned from the beginning, considering the fact that there was no reward challenge on what was always going to be a Sunday episode, and through that be a longer episode of the show. Again, like, it makes no sense for this to be something rigged for Simon, though at the same time, it definitely feels like something very convenient to happen here that ends up causing all the chaos that happens afterwards. Where here we obviously get a challenge that seems very catered towards Simon. So I will say, really cool visual here in the fact that this is a nighttime challenge, and that was kind of cool. Also, we get some pretty interesting strategy during this, where while Simon is winning the challenge and gets extremely emotional immediately afterwards, we instead see George not even trying to play in the challenge anymore, and does strategize with the other players during this, telling Jordy and Frasier to vote for Stevie, while we do see George already concoct a plan to try to flush the idol out of Simon. And again, all this is really great right away, really setting up what is to come, in that when we return to Tribal, we instantly get some scrambling right away, where this is where George seems to fully tell the Spice Girls what his plans are, which again are not revealed to us, which bravo on Australian Survivor. Mind you, I think at the end of the day, it's more so they didn't have the footage. But I do feel like the fact that we're not let in on the ins and outs of George's master plan here is something that really adds to all this. And the fact that the eventual vote off makes sense. It makes sense why it happens, but it doesn't have to be blatantly told to us, which again, I think Australian Survivor just as a whole really struggles with that style of storytelling. It always either blatantly tells us how things are happening or doesn't explain how things are happening. But for us to get this happy medium here was very satisfying to see. But here we do see George instantly calling out Simon and telling Stevie that the plan was to go for Stevie, to which Stevie seems shocked by this, which I don't get considering their entire plan was for Simon to pretend that they were going to vote for Stevie. So I don't get what was really going on here. But obviously this leads to more fighting between George and Simon, with George really making a show of all this. And it's funny that we even have to have Jordy as mediator between the two, talking about how you gotta stop making it personal. But this leads up to the vote, which Stevie ends up being the last person to vote here. And something that I do really love about all of this is that as Stevie is going up to vote, George ends up pulling out his idol, being this massive moment here. Again, really great showmanship here of pulling out his idol at the first instance that it won't matter anymore, as obviously he was trying to put the votes onto himself. But this leads to the big moment for George, in that he now reveals that Jordy has been a traitor and really exposes Jordy here, trying to get Jordy and Simon to come after each other, and tells Simon to play his idol on Steve, as Steve will go home if he doesn't. Which ends up being this really tense moment to where George ends up playing his idol here, really in a position where he doesn't need to. It seemed to be more so just to try to goad Simon into playing his own, to which Simon doesn't, which in turn ends up ruining his relationship with Steve for some reason. Which I will say, all this is just kind of dumb when you really think about it. Why would Simon play his idol on Steve in this situation? Where if he's in a position where Simon is thinking he's on the bottom anyway, and if he loses Steve and he doesn't have Jordy, then he essentially is by himself for the next round. What's stopping them from voting him out now that he doesn't have his idol? So it's like, you really want Simon to play his idol in a position where he's screwed for the following round. And again, I get this from George's point of view, where he's obviously just trying to fracture all the guys, but I think from Stevie's point of view, the fact that he doesn't recognize this is kind of dumb. Plus also the fact that he doesn't recognize that, well, if Stevie is getting the majority of the votes, that means that George was in on getting the votes onto Stevie in the first place, which makes it extremely obvious from an outside point of view that this is just George taking advantage of Stevie, manipulating him and deciding with him. Though on the island, I don't feel like Stevie really got to see it that way. The way that George is able to ham everything up here is, again, masterful gameplay in how he's able to manipulate Stevie into thinking that George was more loyal to him than Simon, while also fracturing all the guys, again, splitting up Jordy and Simon to where they're probably not going to be able to work together. And also later blindsiding Frasier in the vote, where we get a 3-2-2 vote, blindsiding Frasier, this massive vote here. Again, masterful play on paper in that it really solidifies George as the center of the power structure on the villains tribe, where if they go to another tribal, there's no way that George is going home. He now runs the entire tribe. My issue with all this, I do feel like it's a big move that could have been executed slightly differently. I think the fact that he essentially burns his relationship with Jordy through this seemed a bit unnecessary, especially with also him not really gaining any favors with Simon. And it's like, well, yes, he does get an ally in Stevie here. I do think this kind of set him up for a pretty bad swap position, though, through the use of idols and also having Jerry on his side. It kind of works out for him. But I don't know. I will say, like, I do think the long-term effects of this move are a bit questionable to me, even though the impressiveness of this move is, again, very impressive. Again, they take out Frasier, the only person outside of the majority alliance that doesn't have conflict with other people, in a plurality vote, while having completely fractured everyone else outside of the majority, while also gaining Stevie as a loyal number. Again, all that is fantastic. I just wonder if it was a move that could have been executed in a more palatable way, though obviously it makes for incredible TV here, especially with, as Frasier's going up to get his torch, we still have George and Simon bickering to the point where Jordy has to tell him to stop and let Frasier have his moment. Again, all that really crazy, really fun tribal, really great episode. But with that, we lose Frasier, who, I mean, he was there. Who is Frasier? Literally the only thing I remember from him is him fist bumping the Samoans at the beginning of the season, and the fact that he's a real estate agent. Outside of that, not super memorable, barely on the show, really just felt like fodder. But now for episode 8, where here we do get obviously a lot of focus on the ramifications of the previous votes, where Stevie comes back to camp extremely emotional, thanking the likes of Shawnee, Liz, and George for saving him, which, I mean, technically they did, but also they're the people that put the Targons back to begin with. But we get a lot of awkwardness at camp here with, again, George now having exposed Geordi as a traitor. We get awkwardness between Simon and Geordi, but this ends up leading to really great personal content for Geordi. Again, once again, kind of setting him up as a potential winner, and the fact that he gets personal content. Talks about how his life is turned around and he met Sam Frost and how he learned that she was pregnant before leaving, and all that really solid content, along with the fact that we end up finally seeing his relationship with Shawnee and Liz, who talk about wanting to be a 3-person alliance with him moving forward, which again all seems to put him in a pretty great position. But this all leads up to Shawnee seeing the idol during this conversation, giving Shawnee the first of the idols that she finds on this season. But the rest of the episode ends up focusing on the Heroes tribe, where we do get a lot of focus on Jerry, who feels on the outs of the Heroes tribe, which makes you question, why'd you go back? But he says he does so because he didn't want to leave Shawnee behind, which, I mean, that doesn't work out that well for him, does it? But this leads to this really awkward conversation of the Heroes interrogating Jerry about what happened on the other tribe, and Jerry just openly describes how he's on the bottom of their tribe and describes the pecking order, which, again, it is great that Jerry knows this. It is great that Jerry is aware of his position in the game, but the fact that he's openly telling everyone that he's on the bottom and that he should flip is just kind of ridiculous here. But during this, we see Ben now recognizing that he's on the bottom alongside Jerry, deciding to go on an idol hunt, to where he ends up finding the fake idol that Simon has, to where he says that he knows that this is not an idol. But again, funny to see Ben, a newbie, recognize that this is not an idol while Simon doesn't, which, again, Simon is a big fan, so that makes it even more questionable to me. Like, how did Simon think it was an idol? But this eventually leads to Ben finding the idol, which, considering he's the main target for this round, ends up putting him in a pretty interesting spot here, especially after the villains end up winning immunity here. But it also ends up being a notable immunity challenge in that this is the one where they're paired up and they have to hold up a block, and it ends up coming down to Paige and Sharni being the last for the heroes, to which they end up eventually dropping, and Paige is really upset as she continuously complains about how Sharni threw the challenge, which just got really grating to me, where she continuously says this over and over again across the episode. It's like, who cares? No one cares. It doesn't matter. And also, why would Sharni even want to throw the challenge? It makes no sense that she would want to throw the challenge. She's on the bottom. Again, it's just ridiculous that Paige gets so hung up on this. But with Ben having the idol now, and the votes being split on Jerry, it feels like Jerry is the very clear consensus target, which again would have been really bad if he did go out here, considering he could have just stayed with the villains. But Ben talks about wanting to make a big move with his idol here, and that big move is taking out Sharni, I guess, which I will say as a whole, like, I don't really get this move. Like, I don't get why he cared to take out Sharni, where I can get the benefits of having Jerry in the game over Sharni to a degree, in the sense that Jerry is probably someone that is easier to take out the following round over Sharni, where like a lot of this heat on Sharni is coming specifically from this last immunity challenge. So maybe that played into his motivations, but outside of that, it's like, why Sharni? Like, it's like, okay, Ben's swapping out one person on the bottom for another, both of which he has no real relationship with. It's like, again, none of this really made proper sense to me of like, why does he care enough to switch the vote here? But again, we get the tribal where he gets up and tells people to go after Sharni, which gets this votes to split on Sharni, to which she ends up going home after Ben successfully plays his idol, which again was just kind of lame that all this spectacle was just for a Sharni boot. But Sharni was a winner pick coming into this season, which is all kind of funny considering the fact that I did not like her on this season. I feel like Paige, she came off as very self-righteous to me throughout a lot of this, with her continuous talk about wanting to play the game with honesty, and how much of her content was just focused around how much she loves Jerry and how she was upset at how people were treating Jerry. And it's like, again, she didn't really bring much to the table for me. I feel like gameplay-wise, she was very lackluster. She was just on the bottom of her tribe the entire time. And while she does get idled out of the game, it's like a situation where she seemed poised to go home soon anyway. Like, I just feel like Sharni was kind of just a nothing figure on this season. Oh, that we're on to episode 9, where we do get The episode starting with the Survivor auction. Again, cool to see an auction as there isn't one in the US anymore. But at the beginning of the auction, we get the reveal and it's time to drop your buffs. We're getting a swap. A swap that actually plays out pretty interestingly here, with the villains being on the minority on both sides. However, with all the intermingling between the two sides and them being able to spread information and share idols, there's a lot of intrigue going on here, despite it initially feeling like it should just be the villains being put in a bad position. But instantly we hear Geordi talking about how he's upset to be stuck with Simon and that he's in the minority, which I will say a lot of people at this point seem to be very high on Geordi and his winning chances, which I was coming into this episode, but coming out of this episode, I did feel very much like this was setting up a fall for Geordi. And considering how much talk there was even before this episode about how Geordi didn't want to work with the bigger guys, which is ironic considering that's what he did last season, I feel like that even further cemented to me that that was going to be the downfall of his game, which we see in the following episode. But again, this leads up to the auction where really not much of actual note happens here. Again, it was cool to see an auction again, but I didn't really feel like anything here was that interesting, though it does end up having different rules than typical auction where each tribe gets a certain amount of money, though each bid is as individuals, which obviously changes up the dynamic here, but again, not much of intrigue happened from that, though we do get videos from home during which both Matt and Geordi get sympathetic content here as they're both expecting a child, though Matt ends up letting Geordi get it, during which we get Sam Frost on the show. So that's something. But again, this is obviously propped up as a great moment for her. But this also ends up leading us to the final item for the auction, that being a covered item that George ends up winning, which leads to him being a guest of honor at the Survivor surprise party, which he's allowed to take 2 people with him, which he ends up picking Shani and Liz, which again can be questionable in the sense that, okay, you're picking your closest allies, but I also think considering they just swapped, this does allow them to coordinate on what they want to do. But the surprise party here ends up being a pretty big surprise in the fact that George ends up getting $60,000 from this, which is pretty ridiculous. I mean, again, we had this last season of Khan, but at least that was like an intentional thing. That was a thing that everyone knew about. This is literally him secretly being given $60,000 for winning a single item at the auction. And also at this party, there's an idol hidden there as well, which Shani ends up finding, giving her 2 idols in this position. Again, a really insane reward here of a ridiculous amount of money and also an idol in the game. But this ends up giving the villains a lot of leeway here on what to do with these idols, which ends up leading to a lot of intrigue moving forward. But here we end up seeing the initial dynamics on the 2 groups. We're on the new villains tribe. It ends up being an extremely stacked tribe, I mean, an extremely overpowered one, with it essentially getting all the stronger heroes on that tribe with the likes of Sean, David, and Sam, and it also likes Nina and Haley, while also having Simon and Geordi and Liz from the villains. Again, a really stacked tribe in comparison to the others, who probably the strongest member there was, Matt and Flick. But on the villains here, we instantly see Simon flipping over to the heroes, making a deal with Sean, as most people expected, and obviously leading to Geordi being upset that he has the now fake bond with the alpha guys. Beyond this, the new heroes tribe ends up having a 5-3 split as well, but here we do have Jerry being looked at as the swing in a position where, I mean, like, clearly Jerry was going to flip, right? I feel like I never had any doubt that Jerry was going to flip. And considering also the animosity that there was towards Ben, it never really felt like the heroes here were that solid of a group. But leading into the immunity challenge, we do see the new villains obviously win, but in a position where David ends up telling Paige to go for George instead of Ben, switching their minds around, which I really just think shows you how memorable of a presence Paige is, where literally like 2 seconds gets her to switch her mind there. But again, the heroes end up coming for George in a position where I don't get why Ben doesn't just flip here. I mean, the fact that Ben is sticking with the heroes is pretty insane to me, where it's like, I really don't get like what he's thinking is going to happen moving forward. Like, where does he think that he's going to go in the game with the heroes, where he's clearly on the bottom of them, had to use an idol to save himself, was already being talked about as just being a consensus boot already. It's like, it's insane to me that he just doesn't instantly flip. Instead, he agrees to go after George here. Though obviously George and Shani realize something's happening here and decide to now want to blindside Paige, which leads to this really fun moment of George and Shani talking about what would God want, and George says, I don't think God likes Paige, which is funny. But with this, we end up in this position where both sides are planning on blindsiding each other, and we do get some jockeying for Jerry's vote. And we even see this rotation of the heroes heroes one by one going to Jerry and trying to convince him to get on board, which again just should have made it pretty obvious to Jerry that one, again, he's on the bottom of their group and that's why they're so desperate for him, but also should have made it very clear that Jerry was not on board, considering he never even agrees to anything here. But coming to the vote, we do get the setup of Shani wanting to use her idol, which felt pretty clear what was going to happen here, as again it felt like Paige was pretty well set up for a boot. So we do have Shani playing her idol on George, blindsiding Paige, and a really satisfying vote off to me, considering I just found Paige so annoying and I was happy to see her off my screen, while also being a really fun vote off here for the villains to take control of the new hero tribe. And again, Paige, again, I've already said it, was annoying to me. I don't think she's necessarily the worst player in the world, where again, she did seem to build really strong bonds with the alpha guys and with Flick, but also at the same time, I don't think she's the greatest player in the world. I mean, she didn't really seem to have that great of a strategic mind. She had to be convinced to do what was in her best interest by others constantly. I mean, when we're seeing Flick be the voice of reason strategically between Flick and Paige, I think that's seriously something wrong. And really, just as a whole, I didn't find Paige that likable in this season. But that brings us to episode 10, which ends up being another one of the stronger episodes of the season. Though another one where, again, the new heroes tribe doesn't really get that much content. All we really get is Shani and George lounging around, really talking about how much control they have over the tribe, to a point where I did think it came off as a bit over the top. But we do see them talking to the heroes on the bottom one by one, to which George ends up mocking Ben's pitch, which made it pretty clear to me that Ben was probably the next to go. But really, the rest of the episode ends up focusing on the villains tribe, where this ends up being a massive standout episode for Liz, whose storyline really starts here, with her now being separated from Shawnee and her having to play on her own, which seemed to lead to her getting more content here. But her and Jordy are clearly on the bottom, and we do get to the reward challenge, where this really stacked villains tribe obviously ends up winning. Though we do get a lot of cross-tribal talk, where Shawnee tells Liz that she will give her the other idol if she needs it, which ends up setting up this really big move to come. As during the reward, while everyone is eating, we do see Liz sneak off and end up finding an idol of her own, now making it so that she essentially has two idols, where her and Jordy together can now keep each other safe, while also Simon supposedly has an idol, meaning that the heroes are going to have to fracture against each other if they know that all these idols are in play, which is a really fun setup to the vote here. But this is all followed up by a focus on Simon, where here we do have the alpha guys creating a plan on how to use Simon in the game, where their plan now is to promise him safety if they give him his idol in exchange. I mean, something we've seen in the past multiple times. Usually does gain you short-term safety. Usually you wouldn't expect to be voted out immediately afterwards, especially from these more honor-bound players like the heroes here, though obviously is a questionable move of Simon giving up his idol, but I do think it was the right move. Now, at the end of the day, it wasn't a real idol, and that's the major issue with all this, but if it was a real idol, I do think this is a move that does prove his trust to the heroes in a position where he clearly has no social capital left with the villains, and through that, I do think sets him up to be taken deep ways into the game. Now, I think either way, he's screwed. I don't think he really has much endgame potential at this point, but I think considering the position that he was in, I actually don't disagree with his decision to give up his idol here for short-term safety, as really otherwise they're probably going to flush his idol at the following round anyway. But obviously the aspect of this being a fake idol obviously changes that radically, which we'll talk about. But here we do see at the immunity challenge that the heroes do hand over Simon's fake idol to Flick in order for her to take out George, which is fine to see that, as at the same time we see Shawnee hand her idol over to Jordy, making this massive swapping of idols between tribes this really humorous aspect of this round. But with this ends up leading to this really explosive round of gameplay here, where now Liz and Jordy both have idols, and Jordy creates this plan on how to utilize them, which is openly showing them to the likes of Haley and Nina and trying to flip over their votes, as obviously they would in that position have to flip on one of their own, but also get them in a position where they wouldn't have to play their idols at all. And in that moment, in the moment where Jordy mentions that they wouldn't have to play their idols, I knew Jordy was screwed. Where again, I came into this episode expecting Jordy to go home, but at the moment that he got the idol from Shawnee, I was like, okay, he's probably good. There's no way he doesn't play the idol here. But in that moment, that all came crashing down, as I get what he is doing here. I mean, I think 100%. He's obviously trying to get the best of both worlds. He's trying to save both him and Liz for this round, but also getting out of this round with the the idol still in hand where they can utilize it for the following round and in essence guarantee that they're going to make the merge. I get what they are doing here. I just think it is also so risky, as we eventually see play out, though also it is probably the path of least resistance for one of the two of Liz and Jordy. Where the interesting thing about this is that Liz has an idol, Jordy has an idol. So if they both don't play the idols here and one of them goes home, the other will still have an idol for the following round, meaning that they would essentially be guaranteed for merge, you would assume at that point. So again, like, I do think there is a lot of merit to the concept of not playing the idols here. I just personally feel like I definitely would have played it. I feel like this is a situation where I would have been too sketched out to not play it. But I do think either way, it's a risky move and a decision I don't really fault Jordy too much with making. But here, the name that they end up agreeing on to put their votes on is Sam. Which, to be fair, is also probably one of the better figures to potentially put your votes on, as if Sam ends up staying, I think he's probably the one that's the least likely to retaliate against you, while also he's probably the one that's the least usable as a shield and also the one that has the least amount of connections. So I think it does make full sense for them to go for Sam here, though obviously word of the two idols end up spreading around, where we do see Haley telling Sean about this, who then goes and tells David. And strangely, this ends up leading to them deciding to flip on Sam on their own, which I was actually genuinely shocked by. They seem to fully buy into this, and this would have worked into Jordy and Liz's favor here if they did go through with voting Sam out. And coming into Tribal, it did seem like this just would have been a near consensus Sam vote. However, we do see Sam clearly recognizing that something is happening here. Again, showing some decent instincts from Sam, which again, credit to him, I guess. But this is where we do get the really strong play from Sean here, and him recognizing now, and that why don't we just split the vote between Jordy and Sam, as obviously it's still beneficial to try to get Jordy out with an idol in his pocket, still having Sam as the potential backup. This ends up being a pretty strong move from Sean, especially with him putting this together at Tribal, though I also question, like, why didn't you think of this before? And to be honest, at the point where, like, Sean is getting up and telling people to change their votes, I mean, like, again, like, how does Jordy not play his idol in this situation? Like, you would think that this would alert Jordy to being a bit more sketched out, though it just seems like he thinks the plan's gonna go through, and we do see the votes come in where no idols are played, and we get a 4-4 tie between Jordy and Sam, with Jordy getting voted out on the revote, with there being some surprise to Simon flipping, which, I mean, I will say, I don't know how they could be that surprised considering Simon's completely fractured relationships with the other side, but whatever. Again, Jordy going out here is a pretty big shock. I will say, like, again, while I was definitely expecting it personally, I do think his edit up to this point has actually been pretty strong. It definitely felt like out of the people on the board, he could have been one of the potential winners, and his boot here is a pretty big one, being the first vet to be voted out of the game. And in a position where, again, I was overall impressed with Jordy on this season. I was actually surprised to see that he had this in him, where I really did not think that he had this potential to play a good game on his return. And while, again, like, it doesn't really show in the results, I do think as a whole, I think he played near optimally throughout his run here and just gets pretty unlucky with certain circumstances. But had he survived this round, I think he would have been poised to be in a pretty strong spot moving forward, with all of his allies on the original villains tribe and still a potential idol in his pocket, and definitely more leeway moving forward. So again, I do think Jordy actually played pretty well on this season, despite him going out in a pretty explosive way here. But now for episode 11, where again, a lot of this episode focuses on the new heroes tribe, where the villains do get some content, with Liz talking about the plan backfiring and her now being a lone wolf, with her seeming to be on the bottom. That is until we do actually see a new group form within the heroes dynamic, where we do see Sam being upset at how the votes were split onto him in the previous round, ends up talking to Nina about wanting to work with her, despite Nina being one of the people that voted for him. But with Nina's close relationship to David, and David also being close to Sam, it seems like that is a trio that ends up forming here, that they decide to pull in one extra number, that being Liz, which actually ends up putting Liz in a pretty strong position at this point, which, considering Liz also having an idol and also her having very blatant allies on the opposite side, I do question this overall move here. Not necessarily just building a relationship with Liz, but I think the fact of wanting Liz in the game over Simon is something that feels a bit questionable to me, though this is also where we do get Nina being reintroduced to the show after having almost no content since the premiere, and her talking about how now is the time to prove herself and that it's time to take risks. And again, this ends up being pretty strong content for Nina, who had been near invisible up to this point. But again, the rest of the episode is on the new Heroes tribe, where we get a lot of focus on Stevie, with Steve being looked at as the swing vote for the upcoming round, where we see Matt and Flick try to work with him, and later during the immunity challenge we do see Simon giving signals to Steve, trying to get him to flip as well. But really, I never truly felt like Steve was ever actually going to flip here. By the immunity challenge, we do also see Liz telling George and Shawnee about what happened, telling them that Simon has flipped and gave his idol to Flick and Matt, which finally ends up having the opposite effect that you would expect it to, alerting them to how dangerous voting for Flick and Matt could be, to where we end up seeing the vote eventually turn onto Ben because of this fake idol, with them thinking that Ben is the least likely to get the idol played on them, which they are correct, though the funny thing is that, again, it is a fake idol. And funnily for Ben in particular, it is a fake idol that only Ben knows is a fake idol. So it is funny to see Ben here being targeted because the worry of these other two playing an idol that he is the only person that knows is fake. Beyond this, we get a lot of jockeying for Steve's votes, and we also get Steve being portrayed as kind of an idiot here, where we do see Stevie really wanting to split the vote for some reason, despite it being 4-3 and them not having the votes to split, to the point where even Jerry has to be the voice of reason here. But beyond this, we also get a bit of a weird interaction between George and Flick, where George tries to do a similar thing to what he did with Simon previously, and wanting Flick to essentially burn the idol in exchange for keeping her safe, which again, I would never trust George in this position. So I understand why she doesn't go through this, though considering the fact that it is a fake idol, again, it would have been probably the better move to do so. Again, we get the tribal. George once again tries to get her to throw the idol in the fire, and everyone just laughs at him, but turns down the deal, goes and plays the idol, where it is revealed that it is fake, which is obviously this big moment. Again, this cookie idol has been such a major storyline across the season, and for it finally to be revealed that it's not a real idol ends up leading to a lot of intrigue even beyond this. But obviously with that, the vote ends up landing on Ben in a 4-3 vote, and again, I was sad to lose Ben here. I do feel like Ben seemed to be a likable presence on this season. I mean, he was obviously one of the bigger fans, and I do think he got a raw deal on the original Heroes tribe, though that being said, again, the fact that he doesn't flip on the Heroes right away after swap, I think is pretty bad, and overall just seemed to be kind of a messy player, but one that, again, I wouldn't be opposed to a return. I think kind of like a Jackie. I think there was that level of potential there, to where if he comes back and has a group of players that are more in line with his way of thinking, I do think Ben could potentially be a good player. With that, we get to episode 12, where most of the Heroes content from this episode ends up revolving around Simon's idol, and Flick being really upset at Simon for it, and thinking that this was a big elaborate plan from Simon, and that he was trying to blow up her game, and that she now wants revenge, which, really makes no sense. Again, Simon very clearly has nothing going on in the game, and the fact that people are still continuously thinking that he's up to these big schemes is kind of ridiculous to me. You should be able to tell just from his overall demeanor, and he is being genuine in these situations, but for some reason people don't believe it. And again, George really hams this up too, and bravo to George from a gameplay perspective, that he really takes advantage of this situation. He really uses this to further sink Simon, really goading Flick into believing that Simon was manipulating them the whole time, and that they should work together to take out Simon, which again, good on George from a gameplay perspective here. But also we see George doing some work on Matt, to where this is Matt kind of re-enters the show, and while he's had content here and there since the premiere, I did feel like this was the first time that he actually got really solid content of him talking about how he's playing the middle and really setting himself up for being a potential swing vote, which made it apparent that he was going to be important for the story moving forward. But again, most of the rest of the content ends up focusing on the villains tribe, where really this entire episode ends up being this really massive tragedy for Simon, where we do start off with him really being on this high, talking about how he feels like a hero, he feels at home, which all comes crumbling down by the time of the reward challenge. But before that, we do get more talk about this Nina, Sam, David, Liz alliance, as them deciding to target Simon, and we do get some drama between Liz and Simon over him flipping, which again should just further show the Heroes as Simon is on their side. But following this, we get a David confessional. David's on the show. It's a miracle. Again, episode 12, he gets his first confessional somehow. Where again, he seemed like a good player up to this point. We've seen glimpses of him in camp life talking about the game very strategically. It's just that this is the first time we ever got to hear his actual point of view. But this is where we do get set up to this new alliance, not wanting to take out Simon anymore, but instead wanting to blindside Haley, which seemed like a plan that was going to come together by the end of the episode, though with this eventually being a non-elim, it obviously doesn't go anywhere. But here we also get a lot of drama from the reward challenge, where during it, we get the reveal that Simon's idol was fake. And again, we get this massive shock from Simon. And again, I genuinely do feel bad for Simon here. Again, him coming into the season, you can clearly tell that he really looked at this as his chance for redemption, and just everything is going so wrong for him. And I really did feel like it was kind of demeaning to see George just continue to mock him during these moments, which I didn't particularly like that. But again, reward challenge is a pretty basic one of going through a course, tossing a ring, though there were some funny moments throughout this, like Stevie beating Liz out of nowhere, which again, thinking of Stevie beating an Olympian is just kind of humorous. But also the George versus Simon battle was really funny, where Simon accidentally drops his ring and George tosses it away, only for later in the round Simon to pick up George's ring and toss it away there, and that was fun. But through all this, Flick ends up telling Sam that Simon has betrayed them, really setting up Simon as a pretty big target moving forward. And during the reward, we do get a lot of awkwardness here from Simon really just not saying anything about this, which I will say, I do think this is pretty poor play from Simon to just not be out in front and apologizing right away. And I can get that he's shocked by all this and doesn't really know what to say, but at the same time, I do think it is poor play from him for him to really just allow this awkwardness to stew until Sam is the one that has to bring it up. And we do have Simon talking about how he's hoping that Sean sticks to his word, only for us to then cut to Sean and saying that the deal is off, which is all pretty bad content for Simon. And now the plan from Sean is to throw the competition to get rid of Simon, which I think this is all pretty poor play. Now, one in the fact that, again, Simon is actually loyal to Sean. I mean, Simon has no one else in the game, so that's bad, but also Simon's a massive shield for Sean. And while I get that, yes, Simon is this chaotic figure and you don't know if you can trust him at this point, like, one, again, I think that's a bad read on Simon. I think, one, you should be able to know that Simon is not fully lying in this situation, but also, again, where's Simon gonna go? He has nowhere to go. He has no allies. He's such a big target. It's like, why are you throwing a competition to get rid of Simon? And we do see this throw go through where we get this memorization immunity challenge where, again, we see like Nina walking during it. We see Sean really taking his time despite knowing it. It's like, again, like obviously they throw it here. And again, I just feel even more bad for Simon where he's clearly like crushed on the sideline, knowing that he's in danger, and especially knowing that, again, this is the position that he got voted out last time. So again, like, I do get it from Simon of him being genuinely terrified that his mistakes are going to lead up to him getting the exact same placement once again. But in the vote here, again, it does seem like the initial plan is to genuinely vote out Simon, where they're going to split between Simon and Liz. Obviously, Liz is going to play her idol. Though, interestingly, the plan is to have Simon voting for Sam, which means that if Simon has an idol, that Sam will go out. And we do have Nina telling him about this, to which this is where the Haley plan ends up fully coming into effect, where it did seem like Haley was about to be blindsided coming into Tribal, but then we get to Tribal where we get the reveal that tonight is different. Because again, we need another non-elimination at some point, especially considering Jackie's medevac ends up causing another non-elimination to be needed. So again, I was fully expecting one to come at some point this week, though kind of weird for it to be the final episode of the week, but this ends up being a pretty lame non-elim in my eyes, of essentially just it being a chance to mutiny, but it being a situation where one person has to mutiny. It's fine. Again, like, it just seems kind of superfluous, kind of feels like a waste of time, especially considering these configurations don't last that long anyway. And obviously coming into it, it's so obvious that Liz is going to flip here. I really see no incentive for really anyone else here to flip outside of Liz. So I felt like this was a pretty mundane ending to what was a pretty strong episode outside that. But number episode 13, which obviously revolves largely around the new Heroes tribe now that Liz is back with the Spice Girls. This is where we do see Liz sharing the information about the players on the other side, revealing that Haley was about to be blindsided, leading to George talking about how he's going to need to flip Haley over with this information, which I will say, bravo on him. Like, while at the end of the day, I do think Haley was probably going to flip over anyway, considering they obviously had a pregame relationship. I do feel like the way that he utilizes this information ends up being pretty effective here, where we do get to the reward challenge where he ends up whispering to her about Nina planning on blindsiding her, and this really ends up being almost the entirety of the content for the new Villains tribe here, where we actually get no camp life scenes at all with them here, where all they get is them winning the reward challenge here, and that reward ends up being sandwiches, though this is where we do get the one at a time style reward that we typically get at least one of every season. And during this scene, there is a lot of tension here where Nina ends up seeing George telling Haley about this, and we do get a lot of confessionals here from Nina talking about still wanting Haley out. And to me, the reward here really came off as secondary to that, where the reward itself wasn't that interesting to me here. Nothing of that much note really happens until the very end, where Sam is the last person to go, and he really tears up the place, though no one ends up finding anything here, so I felt like overall this is kind of a letdown. But again, back on the New Heroes tribe, a lot of the focus very early on ends up being placed on which of Flick or Matt are going to go, with right away we do see Flick doing some really effective work with the women, bonding with them, though obviously George isn't as responsive here, and he does tell Jerry that he wants Flick out. Again, all in the opening scene of the episode, which did scream out to me that this wasn't going to go through, and I was always waiting for the pin to drop moving forward in the episode, and it just really didn't happen until the tail end, which is what makes the overall edit of this episode very strange. And again, it is largely focused around this Matt and Flick debate that ends up not really concluding here. But also, I understand the problem that they had in making this episode, as obviously the eventual vote out was a last second decision, and they didn't really have the footage to work around that. And we do constantly get shots of Stevie just in the background saying random things throughout the episode that kind of point to his eventual boot, though it definitely wasn't very blatant. But I did spend a lot of this episode thinking something felt off in how openly they were talking about how Flick is the easy boot from the very beginning of the episode, and nothing really changes beyond that despite this inner turmoil within the Spice Girl Alliance. But this is where Matt obviously starts to get more content as well, and I will say I was pretty impressed by Matt here, and that he was able to get George to pretty much fully trust him coming into the merge. Though to be fair, Matt is the type of person that if he does say something, you would expect him to stick true to that. And again, for George in particular, it is obviously way more beneficial for him to have Matt as a number than Flick. Obviously, we get to the immunity challenge, where it ends up being a pretty lackluster one in that we get the return of the endurance comp of them holding up the bags. Though at the same time, there's also going to be a puzzle involved in this, where one person from each tribe does the puzzle. The one that puts together the puzzle the quickest ends up being able to eliminate a player from the other tribe, to which Nina demolishes Steve in this, to where Matt is taken out instantly, and that leaves the New Heroes with literally just Liz, Shawnee, George, and Flick against the likes of a Sean, a Sam, David, a Simon. It's like, obviously the outcome here is pretty apparent, and we do see the New Heroes go the tribal, where again it's still all in on the Flick plan, with George seeming to have the numbers to execute the Flick plan even without the likes of Shawnee and Liz, though we do see him go and tell Shawnee and Liz the plan, which obviously ends up upsetting them and them not being happy about it, but they do seem to go along with it for a bit until Flick ends up reassuring them. And again, like, as much as I criticize Flick as a player, and I will continue to criticize her, it is impressive in the fact that she was able to get Liz and Shawnee to fight so hard for her to stay to their own detriment. So yeah, at least bravo on her for that. But this obviously leads to George now being worried about losing the numbers of Liz and Shawnee if he goes through with the Flick move, though coming into tribal, it still felt like he was all in on the Flick move, to the point where he tells Shawnee that he's still 100% on his vote, until Liz decides to threaten George with using her idol on Flick, which I will say, this is insane to me. And I guess this is where I might as well break down this decision, where really for George, I think this is clear cut. Obviously, I do think getting rid of Flick is 100% better for George. Obviously, he has a better relationship with Matt than Flick. Also, getting rid of Flick is someone that is more likely to flip to the other side post-merge, and it's someone that is more integral to the opposite side than Matt. And I think for the alliance as a whole, this Spice Girls plus Jerry and Stevie alliance, I think for our alliance as a whole, it is 100% better to get rid of Flick than Matt. However, I think the thing that is more debatable for me is Liz's position, where obviously we see it not play out for Liz in the fact that Flick flips immediately afterwards and is willing to cut Shaunie and Liz almost instantly. But I do think for Liz, I can see the argument for her keeping Flick. However, in reality, I do still think it is bad. And I do think a lot of what made them really want to keep Flick around is this notion of not wanting another woman to go, which again is fair, but also not really a thing that I would trust Flick on. And really that is also the kind of ridiculous thing of this all too, is the fact that Liz is trusting her own read on Flick after knowing her for one day pretty much over George, who's played almost 50 days of Survivor with her and has literally seen her do the exact same thing in her previous season. And it is funny, this is literally what happened to Haley back on Brains versus Braun, of her deciding to save Flick, thinking that Flick was going to be an ally, only for Flick to turn against her the following round. And like, I get the notion of like her wanting to keep Flick around so that she can play both sides, as I do think that is something to definitely consider here. But at the end of the day, again, it turns out that she's a pretty expendable number for the opposite side. It's like, while yes, she seemed to be building a relationship with the likes of Nina and a David and a Sam, and again, Flick effectively uses that knowledge against her here, still, with Liz's point of view, I do think it is still a questionable decision. Even though I can see the merit to it in trying to play both sides, though I do think going to the lengths of threatening your own idol is probably a bit too much social capital. And I think when we're getting to Shaunie, I think this is just outright a bad move for Shaunie as well. Like, while I get the fact that Shaunie is attached to Liz and can probably maneuver in the game with Liz, if she does do so, she's pretty much at the bottom of the opposite side anyway, while she's pretty much in a central position in the current power structure, with numerous opportunities to take out the likes of a Matt down the road. So I do feel like for Liz and Shaunie, while I can see the glimpses of merit for this decision, I do think it is a pretty dumb decision to go through with. But this leads to the more questionable decision from George, in that because they're not willing to get rid of Flick, George ends up creating a compromise here of getting rid of Stevie, which makes almost no sense to me, at least in this position. Now, later on, we do see him form a final three with Jerry and Matt, and we do find out that Jerry was extremely close to Matt, so cutting Matt obviously burns his relationship with Jerry, and that wasn't really properly explained on the show at the time of this episode, but still, cutting Stevie to me for George is still very questionable. I feel like Stevie could have easily been George's number, which I feel like is the problem with George's position in the game long term here, is that it feels like everyone around him has a closer ally to themselves than to him, where Jerry and Matt have each other, Liz and Shaunie have each other. George doesn't really have that person, and Stevie could have obviously been that person, but even beyond that, keeping Stevie around would also just give him very easy numbers coming to the merge. And while again, George is able to repair that anyway, I do think the decision to get rid of Stevie here, while not game ending, was certainly one that did lessen their position coming into the merge. But again, we do see this play out at Tribal here, where we see George going to Jerry and see them make the decision to take out Steve. And then we see George going to Shaunie and Liz and tell them to vote Steve. And this all leads to this pretty big blindside of Steve getting voted out in a 4-2-1 vote. And I just felt like this was entirely just sad. And obviously it was supposed to be. It's supposed to be this tragedy for Steve here. And I do really feel for him, where he was just so close to making the merge this time. And he really doesn't do anything explicitly wrong. I mean, like, obviously he's just in a bad position for a lot of the game. He wasn't able to build the correct social bonds and be looked at as this really integral number for his side, but the way he really goes out here just felt extremely random. And Stevie was pretty fun on this season for me. And coming into this season, it was always a question of like, why is Steve here? I thought he brought enough fun energy to the show, kind of being this massive wild card for the show, not really knowing what he's doing. And I did feel like that led to some fun moments. Now, at the end of the day, again, is he a good player? Still, no, he's not. But I did genuinely feel bad for him here, and I'll be honest, I wouldn't be opposed to another chance for Stevie. See if he can make the merge a third time around. But either way, with that, let's move on to episode 14, The Merge. episode. We see more of the deals that are being made right before the merge, where again we do see a final 3 deal form between George, Jerry, and Matt, where all of a sudden Jerry and Matt are shown as having been close since the very beginning, which when did that happen? But also really weird is like this scene really portrays Jerry as this like mastermind bringing George and Matt together, which I found kind of humorous, especially considering he's barely visible beyond that in this episode. But also we do get talk of Simon being the easy target, and that was part of the deal with Flick, is that Simon would be the first to go at the merge, which felt like the position that Simon was in the game at this point, being this very expendable person, this person that everyone could agree on taking out, that also felt like a wasted shot when there's these 2 warring factions, to where with the mere mention of Simon being an easy target here made me instantly realize that Simon's definitely not going. But either way, this ends up leading to the merge feast, where instantly we see Flick hugging the likes of a Haley and a Sean, and have her spilling all the information to the likes of a David, a Sam, and Nina, and it just became so obvious here that Flick was flipping back, which to me ends up being pretty poor play from Flick here. And well, yes, it is the correct move to flip back to the heroes here. I think doing it so blatantly really just paints a bigger target onto her back, and also puts a lot of the blame onto her, which I do think would have burnt her potential jury chances moving forward. But either way, here we do see George and Haley reconvening, to where Haley pretty much seems to flip right away, as she should. Again, she knows she's on the bottom of the original Heroes tribe. Eventually we do get to them naming the tribe, to which Nina wants to name it Vigilantes, but instead they go with George's name instead. But here in the middle of the night, we do see the heroes convene to agree to take out one of Liz or Shawnee, which again, Flick is readily willing to take out one of them here, which again shows how bad of a move it was for Liz and Shawnee to save her, but also again, kind of poor play from Flick as well, to just be so willing to cut the people that saved her in the previous round, just making them feel even more betrayed by her. And we do see this awkward conversation the following morning, where Liz and Shawnee ask her about what the plan is, only for her to end up being a really terrible liar here, and is instantly alerting Shawnee to the fact that she's flipped. But this is where we do see a lot of really great work from George. And I will say George across this episode, outside of one major instance that we will talk about, demonstrates some really masterful play in being able to win back the majority here. Where coming into this round, the original villains are down 8-4, with again also being fractioned the fact that Simon is not even part of that group really. And again, they picked up Jerry over time, but still they're on a pretty big deficit here, to where they need to pull over 3 numbers, and somehow they're able to pull over all 3 of them by the end of this round, where George's relationship with Haley obviously gets her to come over. We have the final 3 with Matt pulling Matt over, and we also here see George putting in some really great work in pulling over Simon. Again, having this massive rivalry that was set up for a lot of the season finally come together here, and really George just ended up seeming to have this really great read on the game here. Again, knowing that Flick was going to flip, knowing that Liz isn't going to get votes despite them saying it's going to be Liz, knowing that Liz shouldn't play a riddle down the road. Again, this ends up being a largely impressive display from George here. But following this, we do get the immunity challenge, the return of Last Gasp, which Sean instantly recognizes as the comp that took him out, which was humorous. And I'll be honest, like I really thought Sean would have a chance in this comp, and I thought that would have been a cool redemption story for him, but instead he ends up going out pretty early, and instead we get a Matt win here, which I'm too fair is kind of expected with him being a lifeguard, that he would be good in the water. Here we do see the heroes really never truly doubt that they don't have the numbers here, which is really humorous to see, especially considering throughout this entire episode I was already expecting George's side to win out. Yet we do see the heroes again being pretty cocky here and talking about how they're gonna flush Liz's idol, with David telling her the last second to play it and how that's gonna work, which to be fair, initially it did seem like Liz bought into this, though I don't get how. Like obviously if they're directly telling you to play your idol, they're not actually going to vote for you in a situation where they can't directly split votes on you. Though this is where we do get talk about putting 2 votes on Liz, and I do think a lot of people were confused over this, where my interpretation of this is that this is them trying to counter a minority vote split, which is obviously a very niche situation, though we've seen this in the past. AK did this back in Australian Survivor All-Stars, and it's like a situation where like I personally feel like if you have the numbers to do it, it's like why not just do it? They are thinking that the other side only has 4 people, and they're not really including Simon in their actual plan, so they only have 7 numbers in a group of 12, so they can't actually split the vote. So the next best scenario is to put votes there in the case that the other side plays an idol, which would give their side the opportunity to play an idol back, in which, in that case, that would avoid the situation of the other side having split their votes in a minority vote split to where they still get their target out. Again, it is a complicated strategic move, though it is one that, again, we've seen in the past. Though at the same time, I don't know if this heroes group is one that's smart enough to create that plan, but I guess you never know. Either way, we do see George's side come together to agree on voting out Sam as the leader of the other side, I guess, which just feels kind of random that they think Sam is leading the other side when he was the person that had votes split on him earlier, but whatever, I guess. But this is where we do get to some of the sloppier play in my eyes from George. Again, something that isn't that consequential really, but this definitely was some questionable play here in that he decided that 7 wasn't enough and that he wanted to get an extra number just in case, and he decides to branch out to Sean, thinking that Sean is going to flip, telling Sean the actual plan of voting for Sam, which is kind of ridiculous to me. Like, I don't get how he actually thought Sean was going to flip here, but also, why tell him the actual plan? Like, really, if anything, you should be testing Sean here and telling him to vote for David instead of Sam so that you can still get out your initial target in Sam. But because he ends up leaking the plan here, they end up having to switch the plan onto David because now there's the worry of Sean going back and telling them to play the idol on Sam. And all this is just kind of ridiculous. I did feel like this was pretty much an overplay from George. And while we do see some people being sketched out by this last second change, it doesn't really seem to play a major factor here. Though it is funny to see Sean, after hearing this, go to Sam, tell him of this, and them seeming to not care and not be worried at all about the votes, despite George seeming extremely confident that he had the votes there. So again, that's kind of humorous as well. But either way, we do get the tribal where, again, there's a lot of talk about Liz potentially getting votes because of her having the idol, which makes it pretty obvious that Liz isn't getting votes here. And we do see George even telling Liz to not play her idol, though we do see her play it anyway for Shawnee, which leads to this kind of funny Benji-esque moment of David asking her if she's sure that's how she wants to play it, which I will say kind of humorous that David, the person who was purpled the entire season, is the person to try to attempt a Benji-esque move here, but that obviously doesn't go through. And it is also humorous considering David didn't know that he was getting voted out here. Again, they were all under the assumption that Sam was getting voted out, during which we have Sam having this funny reaction to thinking that he's going home now. And we do get a fun vote reveal here where George is like really hamming this up and acting like surprised at every vote. We have Shawnee saying thanks Flick midway through. This all obviously leads up to the eventual David blindside, with David not even ending up on the jury here, which is kind of just a sad way for David to go out here. Though this all ends up being a pretty great merge round of the show, even though, again, it led to fodder being voted out. But let's talk about David, who, again, I just feel bad for in the sense that he seemed like an actual good player, yet he just for some reason got completely purpled for some reason. Where, I mean, like, was David that much more boring than the likes of a Sam Webb? And while, like, obviously, yeah, David gets taken out the merge vote, he isn't that integral to the overall story of the season. The fact that he only gets 2 confessionals across his entire run this season, both of those coming from a singular episode, all back to back from each other, is really just sad considering how competent of a player he seemed to be. Again, like, we have these scenes of him seeming to lead the strategy talk, him talking about splitting votes, making plurality votes, him, again, creating this plan to flush Liz's idol. It's like he seems to be an extremely active player, but for some reason we're not really shown any of that. And I do think that's extremely underwhelming considering how solid he seemed to be at the game. Then let's jump into episode 15, which largely ended up being pretty mundane. I mean, more so just continuing off the last episode where this new majority alliance is now formed, and we do see them name themselves the Vigilantes, stealing the name from Nina, which ends up being a pretty humorous plot thread here, though I will say also pretty petty, and I think in a sense kind of bad jury management, and it just feeling like you're kind of rubbing it in her face when we do eventually get the reveal of this name to her. Moving forward, I mean, we really get this hype built up around this Shawnee versus Flick rivalry, with Shawnee wanting revenge, and through that there was almost no real suspense in the episode considering this was a shorter episode. And despite some talks about flipping the vote later on, I never really felt like it was a reality, and I always felt like Flick was going home in this episode. By the way, we obviously see the minority try to get the numbers back, talking about flipping over Simon. And we obviously focus a lot of this episode also around this George and Simon relationship, with Simon talking about how he's buried the hatchet, but the handle's within grasp if he needs it. And again, this all kind of felt like a waste of time, especially considering by the end of the episode, they don't even fully go through with this red herring anyway. Now we do get an immunity challenge that ends up having them hold a rope that is attached to 40% of their body weight, and we do get some fun moments from this. First with George being the first out, and him instantly looking under the bench for an idol, only for Haley to call him out there. We got a lot of fun from Shawnee with her joking around as she continues to get lower and lower. We see the comp come down to Haley and Liz in a position where I really thought Haley had this, considering how masterful she is at endurance comps, though Liz ends up winning this instead. And beyond this, again, despite how much time we get focused around Simon not trusting George and potentially wanting to flip, it just never felt like it was actually going to happen. And again, even the edit kind of gives up on this notion after he has a conversation with Haley, who dissuades him anyway. And at that point, really the entire episode just comes down to whether or not Sean is going to play his idol, which I also very much did not see happening, considering how it seemed like he didn't tell anyone about his idol. And even then, even if he had used his idol correctly here, they're still in the minority for the following round anyway. So this is around the gameplay to me that really just had very little intrigue going on, with the edit really blatantly just pointing the target onto Flick from almost the get-go. But we do get a somewhat fun tribal here in that George ends up mentioning his hat, one that Simon threw in the fire, and that leads to a funny interaction between the two. But also beyond that, I feel like we get a lot of poor jury management during this tribal, which is strange considering Flick, who gets voted out here, ends up being the first member of the jury, and they knew this. But here we end up having, again, George getting into a minor argument with Sam over the semantics of the move from the previous round, which was pointless. We get George also revealing the vigilante name, which again felt like they were rubbing in the other side's faces. And also we get Shawnee calling out Flick for how dumb of a mistake she made, which also felt like that was kind of kicking her when she's down. So I really felt like all this was pretty poor play across the tribal, though obviously Sean doesn't play his idol and Flick gets voted out. And I mean, Flick was fine on this season. I mean, Flick was pretty much exactly the same as last time. I think she played pretty much the exact same game, almost never voting in the majority, seemed to be very good socially to where she had good one-on-one bonds, but never was able to effectively use those. She was constantly outplayed by the likes of George and Haley. Like, I mean, it's essentially the exact same run once again, just obviously taken out a lot earlier in the game. Though I will say, I do think gameplay-wise, her one move of getting Liz and Shawnee to fight for her to stay is probably the best thing she's done in her entire Survivor career. So at least that's a positive dimension for her run here. But outside that, it largely just felt like the continuation of her Brains vs. Brawn game, with her really not improving that much since then. I felt like her run went about as expected, with her not really being someone that I would expect to bring that much great TV. Now for episode 16, which ended up being propped up as having another of these all-time great tribals coming into it, and I will say, largely whelmed by that, though we did get a cold open here, going straight into the reward, which made me kind of excited, thinking like, oh, what could happen after that? But here we get George really hamming up how much he wants KFC, because obviously the reward ends up being a KFC feast, where the reward challenge here ends up being a modification of Get a Grip, which is obviously a classic Survivor challenge, but this one is done in pairs, where last pair to drop ends up winning. And it was pretty cool to see George and Haley win a challenge together here. And they do end up taking Jerry and Shawnee with them for coming in second, being pretty solid picks there. Though strangely, once we get to reward, despite how much George really hams up how much he loves KFC, we do get Shawnee really narrating a lot of this reward, which at first made me think that this is probably really good for Shawnee, the fact that she is getting this pretty unnecessary content, but ends up having a negative tinge to it, and the fact that she talks about how Simon is the most likely to flip, and that's not good that he's back at camp with the other heroes, but things are okay because Liz is holding the fort, only for us to cut to the camp where Liz is taking a nap, which I did find kind of humorous. But here we do see Sean talking to Simon about flipping, revealing his idol finally, and does successfully flip Simon over into getting rid of George here, which I will say, pretty strong play there. And I do think it probably is the optimal move for Simon to break up this majority at this point, considering he is very clearly on the bottom of that majority. Now, obviously, he could have executed the move more effectively here. I do think him flipping is actually probably the right call to make. But again, all this really sets up this vote to be a really interesting one where, again, George could potentially be idled out of the game. And this is all followed up with a lot of content from Haley as well, with Haley talking about how she now wants to flip on George, despite the fact that George seems to be truly loyal to Haley, talking about wanting to take Haley to the end so that he can beat her this time, revealing to her about his $60,000 prize he won earlier. And I will say, I do think a lot of this is kind of sloppy play on George to kind of just think that Haley's going to fall in line with him. Though at the same time, Haley should. And while George is propped up as this big jury threat, I do think it is much better for Haley to keep George in the game than getting rid of him here. Considering how much he wants to take her to the end and how easy it would be to cut him at the end, I do feel like Haley wanting to get rid of George here felt kind of ridiculous. But following this, we do get to the immunity challenge, which ends up being a stacking comp, just kind of boring. Again, I've talked about this before. I feel like the stacking comps to me have kind of gotten to the point where they're predictably unpredictable, and through that, whenever someone's stack falls, it just means nothing to me. So I don't find these super entertaining, but Simon does end up winning the challenge here. And when doing so, he jumps into Sean's arms, which was really over the top, but also, again, really poor play from Simon that he's so chummy with the heroes here. And George even notices this and talks about how the war is back on. And again, just really sloppy play from Simon, and the fact that, again, if he's planning on blindsiding George, maybe try to make it not as obvious. Back at camp, we do see Simon being told the plan of being a split between Sean and Nina, only for George to then change the plan right after he leaves to putting the votes on Sam. Which I will say, again, obviously probably the right call. If you think Simon is potentially going to flip, it is better to put the votes onto one of the people you don't tell him the name of. Though at the same time, it is extremely risky to put all your votes on one person in this situation where there could be idols in play, especially when we see Haley once again decide to take out George here by not directly voting for George, but instead telling Nina the plan that Sam is going to be voted out here. Then you need to play the idol on him, a move that should have caused George here to be dead to rights, especially with the fact that Nina ends up finding an idol immediately after this, meaning that the heroes now have 2 idols in their possession. Where there's only 3 of them there, you would assume that they would play one of them correctly, which should have knocked George out of the game. But then we get talk about how they don't trust Haley. And really this ends up summing up this entire round here, where obviously the plan goes through to vote out Sam. Sean and Nina end up playing the idols on themselves incorrectly, wasting those idols, something that you would think of as dumb on paper. Now I will say, under the context of what they thought was happening, I can understand why they do so. Where obviously to them, they know that Simon is flipping, and they have a lot more confidence in Simon than Haley. So through Simon's information that Nina and Sean are the ones to get votes here, obviously, yeah, to them, they're like, well, yeah, we're going to play the idols on ourselves then. However, when Haley goes and tells them the votes on Sam, to them, it's very easy to interpret that as, oh, they're just trying to trick us into playing the idol on Sam, when in reality it is on Nina or Sean. Now, I think at the end of the day, again, this is a poor read. They should have recognized the fact that Haley was being truthful with them. But again, I can get why they go into the self-preservation mode and playing the idols on themselves. However, I will also say, I do think for Sean in particular, this was pretty dumb, as we do know, based on how the votes were split beforehand, that Nina was going to get the majority of the votes over Sean. It was going to be a 4-3 split on Nina, meaning that based on the info that Simon gives them, that would mean that Sean doesn't need his idol, considering they know that Nina is the majority of the vote there, and they have 4, which beats Sean's 3. So I do think for Sean in particular, I do think this was a bad move here to not play your idol on Sam. Like, I can get being in this state of mind of being worried that you could go home, especially considering you assume that there's at least 3 votes on you. But again, it should have been a position where they do the best of both worlds. They end up believing both plans because they have the opportunity to do so. They have 2 idols, and instead they waste them here. And at Tribal, we do get some great reactions here to the Simon flip, with Shawnee telling him that he's played himself to the bottom, which is ironic considering the following vote. And again, it all leads up to a Sam blindside, which Sam to me here was more of the same from his first time around. I think he was probably a bit more willing to play the game. Again, the fact that he almost orchestrated this vote against Haley, the fact that he seemed to scramble a lot in his last few days. Like, at least there's that. I do think he at least tried to improve his game slightly from his first time around, but still not by that much. I mean, he's really mostly the same person from the first time around. I don't think he's really improved his game to a significant degree, and still doesn't really come off as super likable to me on this show, to where coming into this, I wasn't really excited to see him back, and I don't really feel like he did much to change my opinion on him. But now let's move on to episode 17, which ends up being a pretty massive one here. One that starts off with Shawnee talking about how much power she has and how strong her relationship with Liz is, and how George is the third wheel in their alliance. And we have Shawnee just randomly finding an idol out of nowhere and talking about how someone's going to be blindsided with it. And right away, these were some really big red flags here. I will say, coming into this episode, Shawnee was actually number 1 on my power ranking. I felt like out of anyone left on the cast, Shawnee felt like she had the more traditional Australian Survivor winner edit, but this was obviously really bad all in a row. The fact that they reestablished this power structure within the Spice Girls while also having her come off extremely cocky and also having an idol in their pocket, it really did feel like set up to an eventual downfall. Though I will say, even I did not necessarily expect it in this episode. But again, the beginning of this episode does really focus a lot on this dynamic within the Spice Girls, with George wanting Simon out at this point, though Liz and Shawnee talk about wanting to take Simon towards the end, knowing that they can beat him, which obviously leaves them very separate agendas, kind of similar to what happened back at the Stevie vote. And George ends up being even more resolute in wanting to get rid of one of Simon or Sean immediately after the immunity challenge, where it is one that the physical men there really dominate, and Simon ends up winning immunity once again there. Though I will say also, very strange that the final part of this immunity challenge was another stacking comp immediately after a stacking comp in the previous challenge, but whatever. But through this, like, you would assume that Sean would have been this very easy boot here, but this is where we do get more of this downfall for Shawnee here, where Liz and Shawnee are talking, and George seems to overhear them mention the Shiz Alliance, which ends up greatly irritating him, to where now he knows he's on the bottom of the Spice Girls, and talks about taking the opportunity to blindside Shawnee here, which I will say does feel very rash. I do feel like this is a very early big move to be making that really upsets the core power structure that I do think in an ideal world, if I was George, I would want to wait until probably final 6 or 7 to be making a move like this. Though at the same time, we do see talks from Liz and Shawnee about potentially taking out George at final 8. So obviously this is George taking a preemptive strike here, and I think it's a move that he's essentially forced to make, but at the same time, it just feels so early for him to be making this move, but he is very effective in making this move, doing a lot of really solid work here, where he does end up making a deal with Simon to give him immunity for the following round if he does agree to vote out Sean, to which in doing so, this essentially makes Simon vote against his own ally, causing friction there, while also having appeared to repair his relationship with Simon. He also goes to the likes of Jerry and Haley for advice, where I will say in this conversation, Jerry does seem to talk him down, but I did find it funny that despite Jerry seeming to not agree with the plan at first, he then becomes a pretty integral part of it, where he's the one that convinced Matt to go along with the plan. And then we see George pull over Nina at the last second to just now have an outright majority on Shawnee. Like, all this pretty strong play here. I do think this is all really good play from George in terms of the execution of this move. Though again, the overall timing of the move is still a little bit questionable. Though I will say, coming into Tribal, I really felt like there was no suspense here for a Shawnee boot, where there's no doubt to me that the Shawnee plan wouldn't go through, and I never really felt like Shawnee was going to play her idol either, even though we keep on getting these shots of Shawnee seeming to be sketched out at things. We never even get a confessional about her idol after she finds it, to where it really made it clear to me that again, this was never really a consideration. Though I will say there was a lot of irony in this Tribal Council, where George talks about cutting deals and holding true to those deals, only for Shawnee to say that he's great at keeping his deals. But again, the Shawnee vote is a pretty big one here, obviously. This big blindside of George betraying Shawnee, but also taking her out with an idol in her pocket, also being the first time that this new majority alliance fully fractures, and taking out again the number 1 contender to win the season in my eyes at this point. So again, a really great vote. But with it, we do lose Shawnee, who, technically has her worst run in Survivor here at 9th place. though I think this is probably her best game of the bunch, where it felt like she was in the majority for more of the game here. Really working alongside George for a lot of the season, even directly saving George at the Paige vote. And I do think this shows a level of consistency from Shawnee to where I think this season definitely boosted her overall rating on my top players of all time for Australian Survivor. But I'll be honest, I do feel like this season also showed some glaring holes in Shawnee's game ability as well. Mainly in the fact that I really don't think Shawnee is good strategically. To where Shawnee is obviously very good socially, and that is her main asset in the game, and she is competent strategically. She's not a terrible strategic player. Like, she has solid reads at points, but there are also points where her reads are just so off. And it really feels like George is able to completely outplay her in her strategic maneuvering through the game. That does make me really question that aspect of her game. Though obviously, again, she's had deep runs 3 times now. Mind you, she got saved by Nana Lim and All-Stars, but still, I mean, like 3 solid runs, seemingly progressively better games each time out, despite the fact that her placement is going down each time out. But really outside that, obviously still a fantastic character. I mean, Shawnee is just such a great confessionalist, brings this fun energy to the show, and despite her being the only 3-time player at this point, I actually wouldn't mind seeing a 4th time from Shawnee, even though realistically I don't know how much more there is to change within her game. Now for episode 18, which to me is a major turning point for this season, where a lot of the season up to this point has been this coronation for George as an all-time great player. This is where we get to the point where the edit seems to finally drop George, to where we start this episode off kind of similarly to the previous one, but in this one it's George getting this extremely cocky content, talking about how he's able to reel Liz back in after the Shawnee vote, and we keep on getting these shots to Liz of her clearly not being happy, and we then see the following morning that Liz is extremely emotional and talking about how she wants revenge on George and that she's going to take her time for it, really setting up this winning trajectory for her, but also setting up this downfall of George, which I will say, despite Liz's edit not being the most consistent thing in the world up to this point, always thought of her as someone that was still a chance at winning throughout a lot of this season, largely due to her connection with Shawnee. And the chance that Shawnee did not make it to the end, then I feel like Liz would have picked up that edit while also getting this revenge story in a similar way to how Natalie Anderson was portrayed in San Juan del Sur, and I do feel like that was the style of edit that was given to her here. But again, George really just comes off extremely cocky throughout a lot of this episode, talking about how Simon is the next to go, and we even get this conversation between George and Simon where Simon seems to be offering George a final 2 deal, and George just shuts that down. But following this, we do get to the reward challenge, it being another stacking comp. Though, to be fair, again, at least this is reward. This is the one where you have to only use your feet. And we do see Simon just demolishing this competition, to which he ends up winning a car. But here we do get a picnic as well that he ends up bringing along Matt, Haley, and Nina, during which Haley really starts to take the forefront, talking about wanting to keep Simon around because he's a puppy dog, and restarts this plot to take out George, with her leaking the information that he won the $60,000 beforehand, which I'm a bit mixed on her approach here, where I do think this is a good thing to use to turn the likes of Simon and Nina against George here. Though I think the fact that she loops in Matt to this as well feels a bit misguided, especially when everyone's talking about how Matt's not going to flip and how rigid he is. I do feel like that's just sloppy play. Though also, I feel like as a whole, this was a pretty bad episode for Matt, where obviously we see Simon later try to vote out Matt, but also it just seems like Matt very clearly was not respected while out there at this point, with him talking about how he's not willing to vote out George and people simply just looking at him as a number for George. And when mixing that in with the fact that he flipped against the original heroes and they were upset at him for that, I really felt like there was no chance Matt was winning the game at this point. Despite the fact that, again, he had glimpses of positivity earlier on in the season. But that we jump immediately into the immunity challenge, where here we do have a new type of endurance challenge that was pretty brutal, and them having to squat while holding up an idol, and only Sean and Nina even make it past the 10-minute mark, though Nina ends up winning immunity here, really hyping this up as the first twine to ever win a challenge, which, okay, I guess. But here we do get a lot of focus on Sean being upset that he lost, which really felt like set up to a potential Sean boot, to where moving forward, while there was this Matt plan that was talked about, I never had any doubt that Sean was probably going to go home, especially when we get all the setup to it, where we see George now wanting to work with Sean for the following vote, and also Simon being the target for this round, though Haley obviously wants to keep Simon around. So through that, she ends up convincing George to split the vote, which already is kind of a faulty plan. One in the fact that obviously this eventually allows Haley to flip, though even before that, it also allows Nina to flip and change up the vote result. So if George was really that resolute in getting rid of Simon, him splitting the votes here was a bit of a misstep, though obviously I do get the worry of Simon having an idol. But really, again, Haley gets this big mastermind edit here in putting together this split vote, and now her dictating this vote, which, again, always felt like she was going to vote out Sean. That was never a doubt to me. Though, again, we got a lot of focus on this map plan as well, with Simon really thinking he's putting this massive blindside together. Again, based on the way that people were reacting to this plan, it just never felt like it was actually going to happen, especially the way that Haley was talking about this plan in the confessional as if it was the last possible option. Again, to me, I didn't see this really coming through, and we do go to Tribal, where we do get a lot of irony here from George talking about how Shawnee was complacent, and the moment you let your guard down, it is the time to strike, which, again, in this context could be used for him. Also, here we get awkward interactions between George and Simon, where, again, I feel like you could clearly tell that George knew about this map plan by this point, and this felt very reminiscent of their conversations back on the original Villains tribe. But again, we get to the votes, and they explicitly show Nina's vote here, voting for Simon, which instantly stopped this map plan, though we still get Haley flipping here, making it a 4-3-1, taking out Sean, blindsiding the entire tribe, to which we get a fun array of reactions to this. And once again, we're shown that George is wrong here, and the fact that he thinks that it was Nina who flipped, and really it seemed like everyone assumed Nina flipped here over Haley, which I question, like, why would you think Nina flipped? What incentive would she really have to flip this vote? The fact that Haley wasn't caught in this instance is pretty good play from her. And really, Haley's move here really reminds me a lot of Natalie Anderson's move in San Juan del Sur to keep around Keith over Alec. However, I actually think this is probably more impressive in the sense that she actively goes out of her way to create this split vote in a way that gets her in a position that allows her to flip. But with that, again, we obviously lose Sean, who I would say did impress me for a lot of his run on this season. I mean, he kind of gets voted out here due to pretty unlucky circumstances of George relenting on deciding to split the vote, where really the majority of people in the game were on his side and did want Simon out over him. And again, I do think he was playing a pretty strong game for the first half of it, though at the same time, he was starting to get outplayed by the likes of David and Sam and Nina. And by the time the merge, I don't really know where his actual positioning was within the original Heroes group. And then mixing that in with the fact that he wasted an idol, it's like there definitely are some downsides by the end of it, though I did feel like his run this season definitely went better than I was expecting it to. I mean, the fact that he wasn't one of the first few boots after the merge is pretty impressive in its own right, considering how blatant of a threat you would expect him to be. And just in general, I feel like Sean is a very likable person here. I feel like he's the type of person that is kind of perfect for Australian Survivor, kind of perfectly fits this Australian Survivor mold where they do want these more physical, athletic, semi-celebrities. And considering he's one that clearly knows the game and is pretty savvy at the game, I do feel like he's someone that's kind of best case scenario for someone in his archetype. Oh, that we're at episode 19, where here we see the ramifications of Haley's flip in the previous vote, where again, at the time that happened, it definitely felt like a solid move, one that she's taking control of the game, getting the numbers on her side. However, we see it almost instantly backfire on her, where while yes, it does seem like her plan is to pick up Simon and Nina and trying to get the votes on George, the fact that Nina is being so openly accused of this, one, makes it obvious to her, especially with how the votes are split, that Haley was the one to actually vote, but also gives her no incentive to not rat out Haley, as we do see right away in her going to George and telling him that Haley was the one to flip, also revealing how Haley had leaked the information about the money, pretty much playing out exactly as George wanted it to, and this getting back to him, which causes this entire episode to now be George's plan to take out Haley, which I will say this entire episode was also branded upon being this battle between George and Haley. However, really most of the episode doesn't even end up being that. It mostly is just George one-sidedly taking out Haley with no real suspense to anything else possibly happening, which definitely made this round of gameplay a lot more disappointing to me, even though the result should have been something that was really interesting. And really all this kind of just shows Haley's kind of sloppy play here, where I think this kind of just sums up my opinions on Haley as a player, where I do think she is obviously a very solid, well-rounded player, though I do think her execution of moves can be very questionable at points. I think she's a bit sloppy, being a bit too loose with information, and also probably being a bit too game body, not fully recognizing how people are going to react to the moves that she makes. With this being a major example of that, of her thinking Nina is going to work alongside her, take out George here, not recognizing the fact that by her pinning this entire plan on Nina, while yes, it is a strong move in the sense that Haley is still going to continue to get information, it's a bad move in the fact that it makes Nina upset at her for pinning this plan on her to begin with. So again, Haley's obviously a player that there are moments of brilliance from her, but there's also just a decent amount of sloppy play across both of her seasons now that do exhibit the downfalls of her game. But again, following this, there's really no suspense that Haley is going to be the boot here, where obviously once George knows that Haley has flipped and has Nina on his side, really it's already kind of game over. Where through Nina and then also Jerry and Matt, even though we'll talk about Matt, it's already an outright majority where George can take out Haley no matter what. And this is even bolstered even more from the fact that we see George talking to Liz, where Liz is instantly on board with taking out Haley, and George and Liz seem to have completely repaired their relationship, with now Liz seeming like George's number one ally. So at this point, I had no doubt in my mind that Haley was going to be the boot by the end of this episode, making the rest of this episode just feel like a lot of fluff to me. Not much of it really mattering because, like, obviously Haley's going to go home anyway. But obviously now with the knowledge that Matt was told about George winning the money and did not go back to George with this information, which again, I 100% thought he would, this now leads to George being worried about Matt. Tori eventually gets left out of the plan moving forward, which really feels like a misread from George. Like, well, yes, obviously it is bad that he didn't tell him about the prize money. I think the assumption from George that, oh, that must mean that Matt is working with Haley was obviously not the right call there. And I think through leaving him out of this vote, he does end up distancing himself from Matt. So I did think that was kind of suboptimal play. But an interesting aspect of this episode, though, is that we do finally get the open talk about how George and Haley are friends on the outside world and see how that friendship has affected their game now, with them essentially needing to target each other and George being upset that he let his guard down. I did think that was kind of an interesting dynamic to see, especially for someone like George, who's obviously this really game body player most of the time. But also this continues to reiterate how much George wanted to take Haley to the end, which makes this look even worse from Haley's point of view. But anyway, we got to a reward. Pretty boring stuff there in my eyes. They win a spa day. Liz wins the challenge in what is another stacking competition for some reason. But Liz ends up taking Nina and George, where they form a final 3 deal. That barely lasts, but this very much did feel like the Champagne Alliance back in season 2, of this alliance that comes together for this one specific vote and probably wouldn't matter much beyond that. And we do see them agreeing to take out Haley, while back at camp we see Haley getting Simon, but also getting worried about Simon here being the only true recognition across this episode that we get of like that Haley might not go through with this George plan, and that she talks about how she doesn't think she can actually keep Simon as an extra number and how it's hard to contain him, but they really never go too in depth on all that. But this is followed by a pretty funny scene, again, kind of Chappies-like, from Simon and him in the middle of the night grabbing the rice and dumping out half of it, talking about doing whatever he can to do well in the challenges. And that is followed up by the immunity challenge, where Simon wins immunity, unsurprisingly. But the dumb thing about all this is the fact that Liz was allowed to just stop and go and help Matt. I feel like that was really dumb that was allowed. I mean, Simon wins anyway, so it doesn't really matter, but I feel like that was definitely a dumb production call there. But anyway, following this, again, we see the Haley plan go through, and really the show really hypes up how much Nina is in the swing position now, where she can either vote out George or Haley, when in reality she couldn't, and this was all pointless, and kind of adding to why I was so meh on a lot of this episode is that so much of this back half of the episode was focused on what is Nina going to do, when it's like, it doesn't matter. Even if she does flip, worst case scenario, it's a 3-3-1 where Matt's probably voting out Haley over George. This vote doesn't matter. Though at Tribal, we do get some fun from the fact that George is obviously being very cryptic in how he's talking, to where it can be applied to both Nina and Haley, and that was minorly fun, along with the fact that Haley doesn't even go through with the George plan here, and it ends up being a 4-1 vote. And we also get Simon being a doofus once again, voting for George, saying Kingslayer in his voting confessional, only for George just to say, oh, Simon, right when his name comes up, and all that, really fun content. But again, we do lose Haley, who, again, considering the fact that she came into this season with such a massive target on her back, it is very impressive that she made it this far. I mean, obviously she did get saved by Anana Lim, but even the fact that she even got that far in the game to begin with was pretty solid in its own right. That being said, again, I do think this season really just further cemented my opinions on Haley as a player, where coming into this season, I already suspected that there would be some questionable game decisions at points, and I feel like this season kind of reiterated that. I feel like this season hasn't really changed my overall opinion on her overall game ability, with this season really just cementing it. I mean, really, at the end of the day, she's still one of the best Australian Survivor players, probably being the most openly well-rounded player of the bunch, but does have some pretty big red flags in my eyes that do make me hesitant to think of her as an all-time great player in the grand scheme of Survivor. But outside that, as a character, I mean, she was largely just kind of fine here. Like, obviously a lot of it played into her being the queen and in her relationship with George. That made all of her content pretty heavy-handed here, though. Realistically, I wouldn't be opposed to a third appearance from Haley. It's not something that I necessarily need. I feel like, again, my opinion on her game is overall pretty solid at this point, but I do think she's someone that is going to play extremely hard no matter when she plays, so at least there's that. Now let's move on to episode 20, which finally gives us another Anana Lim, which it's been a while, and I will say, was getting very worried about how late they were waiting for these. But obviously, despite my criticisms here and there, this had been an extremely strong season up to this point. And I do think saving Anana Lims for the tail end of the game usually leads to very wonky pacing, as you already have very little to go off of because of the limited amount of players in the game. But then it also stretch out that part of the game seems misguided. But either way, a lot of this episode really felt like just set up to an eventual Simon boot, which surprisingly doesn't happen, where Simon's really all over this episode, having very questionable play, but again, kind of in the Simon mold of like, it's not inherently bad, it's just the way that he's doing it that's bad, and where he's literally going up to everybody but George and openly telling them that they're pawns and that they need to make a move if they want to win the game, which straight up, he's not wrong. Though obviously for them, the question is, do we make the move now? But even beyond that, obviously this is just a terrible tactic from Simon, being really condescending to people he's talking to here, which again, like, he's not wrong in what he's saying. It's just that, again, the way he's saying it is not a very effective way in getting these people to work with you. Maybe with extremely logical players who were super game body, this would be effective, but with these players with the likes of Matt, Jerry, and Liz, is just going to further irritate them. As we see here, we do see bickering between him and Liz and him and Jerry. We even see Matt get extremely emotional in the confessional after this. So I do think this was all just really sloppy play from him, even though I do think the initial notion is not necessarily wrong. But with that, Matt does start to get content here, talking about how he's worried the fact that he hasn't made big moves and needs to win the money for his family. And you get some decent game awareness from Matt here. And the fact that he seems to recognize that George made a deal with Nina and Liz, and that if George were to blindside Matt, he probably wouldn't tell Jerry, which again was making him seem like a competent player here. And we do see him approaching Nina and Simon, talking about flipping the vote, which leads to our umpteenth Simon confessional, him yelling so excited that he might be in power once again, which, I mean, this has gotten extremely repetitive at this point. Well, this takes us to the immunity challenge, which ends up strangely being hands on the hard idol for final 6, which is weird, but this obviously ends up being a challenge not really catered towards Simon, and through that it ends up being between Matt and Jerry, where after agreeing to go 1 foot, Matt wins immunity here, really setting him up to potentially make a big move if he wanted to, which he doesn't. But following this, it really just seems like Simon is on his way out, though we do see George trying to play the middle a bit too hard in my eyes, of him trying to stir animosity between the two sides, and kind of being sloppy play here in trying to get Liz and Nina to split the vote on Jerry, while trying to get Jerry and Matt to split the vote on Nina. well, yes, this does keep him safe in the case of an idol being played. I feel like this is the sort of thing where like just one conversation could have easily blown up all this. But also strangely, it seems like the only person that knows the true plan here is Liz. Again, once again, George seeming to fully be loyal to Liz. But again, not in a situation where I think Liz is actively playing George in this situation. Where yes, obviously in the confessional she did mention that she wants revenge on Shawnee. But I do think at this point in the game, she is genuinely loyal to George, seeming to be his true confidant at this point. But following this, we really see this Matt move really just break down, where while Matt does tell Simon that he wants to vote for George, we instantly see Nina not trusting this plan, and even Simon in the confessionals openly saying that he thinks it's a decoy plan, but acts happy anyways, which is just kind of humorous. But through all this vote splitting, we do see George start to get worried that he might have split it wrong, and that Nina might flip, and he might go out because of that, kind of setting up the eventual tribal, where we get to tribal, where it ends up being a lot of whispering going around for like no reason, where Simon's really trying hard to flip votes, talking to Nina, where they do a handshake. We have Simon whispering to Matt, and this seems to get George paranoid enough to where him and Liz eventually agree to switch their votes onto Nina, giving us a surprise unanimous Nina vote, where Nina ends up voting for Jerry as planned, meaning that Simon somehow got away with getting no votes here, which is pretty insane. But this is also where we reveal that, again, it's a non-LM. And the twist here is that the two people with the highest number of votes will go into survivor isolation, being separated from the other players for 24 hours, not being able to leave that area for anything outside the next tribal, meaning they don't compete in the next immunity challenge. Which I will say, inherently, this just sounds kind of lame, because it's just making it pretty likely that one of these two people are going to go home, as they can't really communicate that well with the other side, and also can't compete in the immunity challenge to save themselves. Though I will say, I think this definitely could have played out a lot worse, obviously. I think this kind of played out near optimally, where Simon wasn't sent to isolation, and through that can compete in the next immunity challenge, while also Nina and Jerry, who are pitted against each other, get sent together. So again, all this played out pretty well, but I think this was kind of a dumb twist to begin with. But now for episode 21, where we do get a resolution to the survivor isolation twist, which turned out to be fine. Again, I felt like there was a lot of good setup here in that Nina and Jerry were together and could talk about how George was playing them, and we do get that. We do get a lot of talk in this episode from Jerry about how he feels betrayed by George, and it felt like it could potentially be going somewhere, but then it just doesn't. And really, this episode ends up actually solidifying the power structure even more, where George seems to get back with Matt, fully be in lockstep with him, but then also be able to reel Jerry back in by the end of the episode, and also solidify his bond with Liz. So really, despite this potentially turning out really bad for George, it actually played out almost as well as it could have. Though we do have Nina doing some pretty decent work with Jerry, telling him about the Jacuzzi 3, and trying to get him to flip, though again, it ends up being all for naught. Though strangely, despite this being a very strong episode gameplay wise from George, it felt like the edit didn't fully back him up here, where it did feel like George was kind of being portrayed as a bit pandering, and that he brings in a chair early in the morning to give to Jerry. But then also we have him being super confident in his relationship with Jerry, only for Jerry to raise his doubts about him. So it did feel a bit undermining here. Eventually we get to the immunity challenge, which surprisingly ends up being another stacking comp. Those ends up being a new challenge that was just kind of weird, of like them having to set up dominoes on like a disc around them. And it does become super close between Matt and Simon, with Matt barely winning out there, kind of being this fun downfall for Simon, who again had the entire structure set up, just was a second too late, which feels pretty apt for his entire game. And with that, I thought it was pretty clear Simon was going home. To me, there was never any true doubt. And if not Simon, then it was Nina, which is like either one isn't super interesting as a boot here. Even though, again, we still get talk about taking out King George. And really, George's plan here ends up essentially just doing what they were planning on doing the previous night, just doing it again and actually splitting the vote here, which I will say is kind of underwhelming. As again, it's literally just replaying the same round over again. Just this time Simon does go home, kind of making the good work that Simon did the previous week all for naught, which I do think is a shame, though. Simon was kind of dead to rights anyway. But again, we do see Jerry talking to Matt, seeming actually interested in flipping. Mind you, that conversation was in front of Nina, so really it could have all just been a ploy. But right before Tribal, we get a strange line from Jerry talking about how George is his mentor, which leads us directly to Tribal, where Jerry just gives this massive emotional spiel about how he's not a pawn because he's learning from George, who's his mentor. Did you see George getting emotional over it? And that was just kind of a weird moment to me. I guess good for George, but also like it takes out all suspense here, and the fact that obviously Jerry's not going to flip after this, where we do get a tie between Simon and Nina, and Simon ends up getting voted out, with Nina saying that she changed her vote at the last second, which is funny, as if she didn't, she would have been taken out in a 3-2-1. But Simon was obviously an incredible character on this season. I mean, Simon probably had one of the best story arcs I've ever seen from Australian Survivor. I just think this rivalry with George at the beginning of the season and see how that played out, and to see it last for so long was really interesting to see, and to see him also be this underdog figure that was kind of just scraping by, never really successfully doing anything, but somehow making it through round by round, and also seeming to have a big chance of winning the jury vote if he got to the end, where it seemed like the jury adored him. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think he played particularly well, though at least he was very self-aware of that, to where it feels like that's the sort of thing that a jury would respect. And Simon, I just think was an incredible character. I don't know if he's necessarily improved his legacy as a player, or to be honest, I was kind of expecting him to be a better player coming into this, but certainly had an interesting story on this season, and it's something I definitely wouldn't be opposed to seeing for a third time. But now moving on to episode 22, which was just kind of boring. I really didn't feel like there was that much suspense here. But we do start off with a Final Five breakfast for some reason, where they just randomly give him a muffin, coffee, and sugar again for some reason. Like, this was just so weird. Like, why was this here? Following this, we get George gloating about his position in the game, which I will say, it is insane that in this episode, George is the swing vote, where essentially there are two sides. There's Matt and Jerry, and there's Liz and Nina. And George throughout this entire episode is this determining factor on where he's gonna go, which just based on the edit, I felt like it was pretty clear he was gonna vote out Nina here. But again, like, for someone like George, who's this massive threat in the game, for no one to be going for him at this round is pretty insane. Though I will say, obviously his eventual decision is very questionable. And obviously I will credit a lot of this to his relationship with Jerry. It seemed like his relationship with Jerry was so strong to the point where he didn't want to betray Jerry, despite the fact that he recognized that it was better for strategic positioning. Where getting rid of Matt keeps Nina as a big threat for the following round, while also lessens the chances that Matt and Jerry are going to cut him if there is a final two, but even beyond that in the final three, if Liz wins immunity, he'll obviously be in danger. So again, it's definitely the optimal move here to get rid of Matt, especially on the assumption that George wins in any final tribal scenario, but he doesn't here. And this is an episode where we do interestingly see Liz finally come back to the show, which I will say, Liz's edit really was a strange one to me, especially at this point in the season, where I was very much expecting her to have this massive rebound in the edit after the Shawnee boot, where she would be constantly talking about wanting to take George out to get revenge, but that simply didn't happen. We got it one time, and following that, she was just seemingly blindly following George, seemingly actually loyal to him, until the point that he betrays her again, which I just find to be a very strange storyline, and one that does make me question Liz's overall game ability, especially in the sense that if she was actually intending on taking George to the end, and that is a very questionable move, though she does get a lot of content here about wanting to bring back the Jacuzzi Alliance together, getting George and Nina to vote out Matt, with her highlighting how Matt is her biggest threat in terms of physical competitions, but also talks about how he can win a jury vote for some reason. And this all plays out perfectly for her, where she does win the immunity challenge. And again, like, considering the fact that I was assuming that she was a likely winner at this point, it was weird to see her get hyped up for making this move, a move that doesn't even go through, where she continuously talks about taking out Matt and needing George to go with her to take out Matt, only for George to not vote with her and her being blindsided by the time of tribal. So again, that was all underwhelming there, and really Nina doesn't really get that much to do in this episode, despite this being a reboot episode. And we do get the tribal, where she makes some offhand comment that really gets propped up as like a big mistake for her, which I didn't fully understand why. But then we also see George talking about how he flipped took this vote because of what she did at Tribal, which is like, I don't get how that happened. And also, I don't even know if I fully believe that, as it did seem like George did want to stick with Jerry and Matt. Either way, she goes out in a 3-2 vote. Liz is obviously upset, and Nina openly tells her that you need to make sure you don't sit next to him, which, I mean, I will say, if I'm Nina and I'm out of the game, like, wouldn't I want George to win at this point? Like, we're at Final Four. It's like, how much more interesting gameplay can really happen at the end here? Like, I feel like this was kind of unnecessary. The further urge on this sniping of George here. But anyway, we do lose Nina, and she got a bit of a strange edit here. One where she was near invisible for the first half of the season. But she did get a solid premiere and a solid last few episodes of the pre-merge. Through coming to merge, I didn't think she was like completely dead to rights. And she does end up being one of the most constant presences throughout the post-merge, being one of the few people to get a confessional in every single episode. And considering the fact that she played from the bottom, I do think she played pretty well. I mean, she was able to get in George's good graces and be part of certain blindsides. And while at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, she is taken out towards the end game here, I do feel like she did very well for herself, considering she was instantly on the bottom after the merge. And really just in general, I think she's a solid all-around player, though one that I'm just disappointed we didn't get to see more of her, particularly early on in the season. But now for episode 23, the penultimate episode of the season, and ends up being an on a limb, which was pretty lame. Obviously, at this point, we did come into the final week with 4 people left in the game, so it was either going to be an on a limb in a final 3 or a potential final 2, with final 2 obviously being my preferred option. Though I was not completely surprised at the final 3, especially from the fact that Australian Survivor has been wanting to do a final 3 for a while now. Obviously, we know that they finally got it to happen in Blood vs. Water, though even at the time of All-Stars, the initial plan was to have a final 3 until Lee got taken out of the game, and the same thing with Brains vs. Braun, where Chelsea getting medevac led to that being a final 2. So the fact that they are sticking with the final 3 here is not that big of a surprise. That was a disappointing trend. But either way, I mean, really the bulk of this episode ends up being relegated to the later twist, though we do start off with a lot of content around Liz. And to me, this was the point where there was no turning back at this point. I felt like it was pretty clear that Liz was going to win, especially considering how much setup there is here to Liz getting revenge on George after he had just betrayed her again, and also the later content of Matt and Jerry talking about cutting George at 3. It really made it clear to me that George was going to come up just short, with Liz being set up to win here, with again a lot of Liz's content here seeming to undermine George, though at the same time I will say from an in-game standpoint, I feel like this content really made me less impressed with Liz's game, where she makes it very clear here that her initial intention was to go to the final 2 with George, which seems like an asinine move. While yes, there is this potential bitter jury factor, I think the fact of her actively wanting to go to the end with someone like George over someone like a Jerry is pretty insane to me. And even beyond that, it's like it very much feels like she did put all of her trust back into George after he betrayed her at the Shawnee vote, which seems to go against her entire winning trajectory that was set up there. By the way, here we do also get content from Jerry talking about how his mission to take out the OG heroes is now complete, which I love it, like that was a storyline that was like set up back when he got voted out, yet was like never mentioned again until after it was already done. By this point, I thought it was pretty clear that Jerry was probably the least likely to win the game, and this felt like his consolidation prize. This all ends up leading up to the challenge, where when arriving, we get the reveal that they are not playing for immunity, but instead they're playing for an extra vote. Which initially this is played pretty straight. They are still going to be voting out somebody, but just with someone getting 2 votes, which even if it had played out this way, I do think this is pretty bad. Now, I think it's an interesting idea to not have immunity and give someone 2 votes, though at the same time, an extra vote is not super powerful in the grand scheme of things. And while it is more powerful in these smaller configurations here, we only have 4 people, it's still not the outright majority. And beyond that, the more damning thing is that it gives the majority more power, where the majority has more chances to win this extra vote and then also gain more power through having the extra vote. So if this round had played out as expected, I do think this would have been a pretty bad twist, especially because like it ends up being an obstacle course that Matt just demolishes and no one's really that close to him. Though after that, we get the reveal that this is not a normal vote coming up. It is going to be a jury removal vote, which that I don't mind as much. Though I will say the extra vote here obviously doesn't really play that much of a factor, as I do think Matt would have gotten the votes anyway. But the jury removal twist as a whole is one that I personally don't mind, especially as a game mechanic. I think as a game mechanic, I actually like it. It requires awareness of the jury and showing the jury that you know how they are perceiving you. And I do like that aspect of it, even though I do think if someone were to win solely due to the jury removal twist, it would be kind of lame. Outside of a situation where it was going to be like a tied vote beforehand, though, I do think it is cruel on the players. Now, I do think it works out in the best possible way on this season. I think in many situations, it really just feels cruel to the players to have them get to this phase of the game where it feels like this accomplishment to be able to award an eventual winner, only to then strip that away from them, particularly from the initial target we hear from this round, that being Simon. And I would have been truly gutted for Simon if he got taken out of the jury. Mind you, it would have been pretty in line with his overall arc on the season, but I would have felt really bad for him considering how much he wanted to be on the jury here, especially coming from a massive fan, someone that was the last pre-merge boot in the previous season. Like, it really would have sucked for him. And we do see, again, George and Liz initially wanting Simon out, which I will say the overall talk about Simon through this, like, while part of it is game, I did feel like this talk about how he doesn't deserve to be on the jury felt a bit much. After Simon gets mentioned, we then get talk about taking out Nina, where Jerry seems upset at what Nina said the previous episode and wants to take out Nina to avoid a girl power vote, which, why? I mean, again, Nina is very likely to vote for Liz, obviously. Or I do think the fact that Jerry puts all that weight into just being girl power was kind of dumb, and really Jerry's entire motivation moving forward seems to be on the basis of him thinking that all the girls are going to vote for the only girl left, and that seems a little icky. But obviously here we do get the plan that actually ends up going through in Matt talking about now wanting to take out Shawnee, with obviously her being a locked-in vote for Liz. And this is where Matt's entire game to me is recontextualized, where he openly says in confessional that his plan the entire time was to cut George at the very end, which is the move. I mean, George is someone that is just so primed to be sniped at the very end. He's someone that is never going to win final immunity, but also someone that has the potential to lose to a bitter jury, where even if he does sneak his way through, there's at least a semblance of a chance. But even then, to see Matt fully articulate his game of getting to the very end with George and then cutting him at the end was finally what I wanted to hear from Matt, and him being aware of his game, being aware of what he needed to do to potentially win the game. Now, I will say that I do think he should have probably done a better job beforehand in managing his perception. At the same time, that would have made George more aware. So I do think it's a double-edged sword, but to see him finally being open with wanting George out and this all being a plot to increase his chances of winning against Liz, I do think is very impressive play from Matt here. And we do see him turning Jerry around on this, and coming into Tribal, George does seem to pick up on what's going on here, largely due to Jerry telling him that he's not sure if he's going to go with the Simon vote, which was kind of ridiculous. But yeah, we get a lot of whispering at Tribal, but it all leads to a 4-1 Liz vote, with George flipping as well and Liz being shocked once again. But with that does take us to the finale, which starts off with the typical game intros of each player one by one talking about their games. Though really, again, I never had any doubt throughout this entire episode that Liz was eventually going to win, especially the fact that George was left in the middle of this segment while Liz was saved for last, talking about how she's an Olympian that pushes her body and talking about being ready to get it done, and it just felt so obvious at this point at what was going to happen. And we do get to the final immunity challenge, which was a decent one here. I mean, it wasn't hands on hard idol because obviously they used that earlier. Though I also question why didn't they do it, as they've done it the previous 2 times they were in Samoa. But either way, we did get the perch challenge instead, which is also fine, especially because they add in this aspect of there being spikes in their backs that get cranked forward after a certain increment of time. So again, a decent final immunity challenge here. Definitely still better than the recent US seasons. But also we continue with the AU trend of family coming out, with the first loved one being George's and his loved one being Kara from Brains vs. Brawn, which was so weird. So just like the entire concept that he decided to bring out Kara instead of his mom is still super funny. But beyond that, kind of what you would expect. Liz's boyfriend, Jerry's fiance, Matt's pregnant wife. With that, we get to the eventual challenge where, as expected, it ends up being Liz versus Matt. Liz ends up winning here after 4 hours. And now we finally get Liz's revenge story that was promised earlier about her wanting George out to get revenge for the 3 times he's blindsided her her, which, I mean, it took him 3 times of blindsiding her before she actually goes through with it. But really, again, like, I do feel like this is a really overhyped move for Liz. I do feel like Liz is really doing the complete baseline move here of voting out the guy that everyone has told her is the biggest threat in the game, and also this guy that has continuously betrayed her over and over again. So, like, despite how much credit she seems to get for this move at Final Tribal, I don't really give her much credit for this, as really if she did anything but vote out George here, it would have been an astronomically bad move. But interestingly here, we do also see Jerry talking about him not wanting to break any promises and seemingly giving the go-ahead to vote him out, which was very strange, especially considering immediately after this tribal we get talk from him about how much he needs the money, which is like, well then why did you tell them to vote you out? This ends up leading to this easy setup of it's George or Jerry, where right away Matt ends up talking about how he's never going to vote out Jerry, and really again there was no real suspense here. I feel like it was very clear George was going home. I don't even feel like they tried to create this potential backup of George not going home, which I guess plays into George's downfall here. Though I do think as a whole, I would have wanted George's downfall to be portrayed in a grander way. I just felt like George's vote off here was just very unceremonious. I felt like it was just kind of underwhelming. It didn't feel like this big grand moment you would expect it to be. It just felt like, okay, everyone's just voting out George. To where again, I do feel like there was a lot of wasted potential here in how they portrayed this scene and how they could have set up this scene a lot better, to where by the time it actually happened, it didn't really hold that much weight for me. But either way, we do lose George here, obviously the star of the show, the star of the season, getting a ridiculous number of confessionals. I believe around double the amount of the rest of the Final Four combined, which is ridiculous. But George is one of the greatest characters to ever be on any form of Survivor. I mean, he is just incredible TV. He knows how to ham it up. He plays extremely hard. He's really just everything you would want from a Survivor player. And I think on this season, he really elevated his game, where Brains vs. Brawn, I've always thought of as a very strong post-merge game from George. However, his pre-merge, particularly his pre-swap, has always been extremely rocky. However, I feel like this season, he really elevates beyond that. I think he played almost as well as he could have. Again, he did make a number of minor mistakes. I do think he is a bit too cocky, and really, I just feel like that's George as a whole, is that he does have this air of confidence about him that kind of turns some people off at points. However, I think considering it is George, I think he played nearly as well as he could have here. Well, again, there were points where he definitely could have potentially been in danger. I mean, he needed an idol to survive the Paige vote. He got extremely lucky during the Sam vote that didn't blow back on him, though he really seemed like the main orchestrator of really the majority of the game. However, he just seemed to have no real path to the end. Now, I do think if Liz did not win final immunity, I do think he could have at least gotten to fire making at 4. However, even then, you would assume he's not going to win fire making. Like, I really feel like there was no way George was actually going to get to the end on this season. But obviously, the season was still filled with a lot of impressive play from him. Play that for sure makes him one of the best players we've seen on Australian Survivor, and him debatably playing the best non-winning game we've seen from the show. And it's someone that I would fully expect to see play again at some point down the road. And with that, let's get into the final 3, where we obviously get time back at camp, where this is where we find out that the final 3 here ends up being all newbies, which is very strange because when we came into the merge with 8 vets, 4 newbies, David was the merge boot being one of those newbies, yet somehow from that point on, it was all vets getting voted out. Literally the entire jury is vets, which is actually insane. That's how this season played out, especially considering the fact that these newbies weren't even working together. It's not even like they made a newbie alliance and tried to get to the end together. That simply wasn't the case, which makes this even more insane. But again, we get more traditional content here, setting up Final Tribal, during which Jerry strangely gets the final say here, where he talks about how his life was destroyed by COVID and he needs the money, which again was great content for him, but like also very strange considering he ends up being blasted at Final Tribal. But we do get the Final Tribal, which I am very mixed on. Obviously, the story of this Final Tribal is how Liz really just demolishes it. She has this air of confidence about her and is able to really play up her game to where it felt like the jury was just completely eating this up. And it really felt like Matt and Jerry had stumbling blocks along the way to where it really just felt like a pretty clear-cut Liz win here. Though I will say, I didn't personally love Liz's performance. I mean, I think this is kind of a situation, kind of like a Christy or an Adam from Lineage Gen X, or probably less so a Marianne, but they're selling their games at Final Tribal in a way that are simply not true. However, the jury just eats it up and ends up voting for them, which just kind of annoys me to a degree, where like, I feel like for me, whenever I see a performance like this, it makes me want to vote for these people even less. Where obviously I've been very open about how I think Christy played a really bad game, and I wouldn't have voted for Christy. I would not have voted for Adam Klein and Millennium Gen X either. I don't know if I would have voted for Liz or not. However, I do feel like her performance here just kind of annoyed me, even though I recognize, okay, it's really playing well to this jury. And the fact that she fully takes credit for the George vote is something that just seems kind of dumb. And I get it that, okay, she won final immunity, so people are always going to give credence to that. But in reality, she had very little to do with actually getting that move to actually happen outside of her own individual vote. And later, she talks about this revenge story with George about how she wanted to get revenge for Shawnee, when it's like, we've seen confessionals from her saying that she would have wanted to go to Final 2 with George after the Shawnee boot. To me, it just felt like a performance that I would not have bought myself. Yeah, again, it really plays into the jury. She does a very good job at buttering up the jury, talking about how she's learned from all the returning players. And she does have a lot more proactive moments that she can bring up about her game. Where, again, the games of Matt and Jerry are games where they were more so playing from the background, kind of playing alongside George, and Matt in particular was just waiting for a time to strike on George. Where again, I think there is an issue there in terms of how they were very much banking on a Final 2, but I do think there's still merit to their games, where really, I think between these three, I don't see that big of a difference between the overall game that they played, but obviously Liz was able to sell it a lot better and was able to lie about aspects of her game that were able to prop up her game even more. Where again, we get to Matt, who I think had a very strong opening pitch. I think he did kind of do what you would want him to do in his opening pitch of talking about how he actively built up this nice guy persona. He talks about wanting to be a representative for the season. He talks about the different facets of the game. Like, I think he does what you would want him to do. So the main stumbling block for him comes from when George asks him what move did he do on his own, to which I did find this kind of annoying in the fact that he literally answers George's question right away with saying, I got you out, only for George to later say, just tell me what your move was. He's like, he did. That is his move. That's really like the entire basis of Matt's game, is for him to be the one that makes the George move. And again, it's fair that, okay, they didn't give him credit for that. And a lot of that is based around the perception that he built up to that point. Though at the same time, you're asking him what his move is. He told you his move. That is his move. That is his only true move, is getting in with George and then cutting him at the very end. And it's also Liz's response to this question I didn't think was great either, but this is really just another instance of Liz kind of showing a lack of awareness of her game, where she talks about how her and Shawnee were always making moves against George that he didn't know about, when it's like, what do you mean he did? That's why he did the things he did. That's why he blindsided Shawnee. That's why he made this Final 3 deal with Matt and Jerry. That's why he constantly tried to keep Matt over Flick. It's like, what do you mean he didn't know? And also ends up hyping up her getting George to take out Stevie over Flick, which is like, yeah, but also that was a bad move. Like, Flick literally flips on you immediately afterwards. Like, to me, none of this argument would have worked on me. I just feel like all this was just kind of stupid from my perspective. But again, it feels like the jury buys into it. But then we also have Jerry, who also does stumble a lot here, particularly in talk about his social game and the fact that he supposedly didn't get to know a lot of the bro-y guys. And we do have Sean giving a great comeback to him and saying that you don't know my hobbies, but I know yours, and you're making assumptions, and you didn't take the time to get to know you, which really just shows you the downfalls of Jerry's game, where I think Jerry is a player that finds his solid group and sticks with that. And I think that does show a lot of rigidness in Jerry's game, to where, again, I do think there is merit to Jerry's game. Jerry is the only person here that consistently stayed in the majority throughout the entire post-merge. Obviously, there was just other failings outside that, but again, all this was just a very clear setup to a Liz win, where we do get the winner reveal, the family comes out again, it's so dumb, breaks up the pacing, we get a unanimous Liz win, which I will say that I was actually genuinely surprised by, mainly because like I did find it very strange how Haley in her Jury Villa video got this like segment to talk about how much she loves Matt's game, only for that to lead to nothing, which I just found really humorous. And I think the Liz win is fine from a TV standpoint here. Again, I think the most satisfying outcome would have been the George win. I think if George weren't to win, I think the Liz win makes the most sense after that. Well, again, for me personally, I don't look at Liz's game as that much better than the likes of Matt in Jerry, I do feel like it at least makes sense game-wise why she does win here. And I think it also fulfills her storyline. Though in a way that I do wish her storyline was a bit better executed. But overall, again, satisfying conclusion to the season. But with that, let's start to wind down the video talking about the final 3. Where obviously we have a tie for second place here. So let's start off talking about Jerry. And Jerry, for me, again, played a better game than I ever expected him to. I think coming into this, I always expected him to be one of the first few boots and for him to not really have much game sense. But I think he actually genuinely played a very solid game. And now we do hear about his social game and how he kind of failed at that. But I do think in terms of his maneuvering through the game, I was actually very much impressed by him. And the fact that when going to the Villains Tribe, he's able to build this like super solid bond with George to where George goes out of his way multiple times to appease Jerry is pretty impressive on Jerry's end. I mean, a lot of the reason why Stevie goes home over Matt is because of Jerry. I think a lot of why Nina goes home can be attributed to Jerry. A lot of the reason why George flips to vote out Shawnee from the jury can be attributed to Jerry. I think there's like so many points in the season where Jerry's influence over George did play a factor. And considering the fact that he did work alongside George throughout the entire season and remain in the majority alongside him is very impressive to me. Now, again, like I think at the end of the day, I don't think Jerry had any respect from the jury to where he would have ever won. Or really his only winning scenario would have possibly been a final 2 with Matt. But again, I do think that there's an argument that I would have voted for Jerry of this 3. I think the only potential major knock against his game is the fact that he was voted out of the original Heroes tribe. But even that was a situation where he was voted out because of the announcement of the twist. So if it wasn't for that, they would have voted out Ben instead. Now, from a grander perspective of things, though, I don't think Jerry is the greatest player in the world. I think he played a solid game. And by that, I mean, I do think his decision-making at points is still questionable. Specifically, again, his choice to go back to the Heroes after knowing he was on the bottom of them, that's pretty bad. The fact that he did genuinely seem to want to go to the end with George until he was essentially forced to not do so seems pretty bad as well. But I do think there is a lot of merit to Jerry's game, more so than people will probably give him credit for. And I came out of the season very much impressed with him overall. With that, we move on to Matt, who I also think is a solid player here. I mean, Matt is someone that, again, without the knowledge that he planned on cutting George the entire time, I think there is a lot more to truly knock from Matt's game. However, with that knowledge that he always intended to vote out George, I think that greatly recontextualizes his game to where he does end up coming off as a very solid player here, one that knew that George would be a very easy person to take out at the very end and was able to set up this winning scenario for him the entire time. The problem is that the basis around all that was the fact that we were going to get a final 2. Or I think that was the game that Matt was playing here, is him expecting to get to the final 2 with Jerry and being able to cut George at 3. Though obviously with the knowledge that it's a final 3, which is something that I do think they should have greatly considered. I think there is stuff to knock with Matt's game here, but I still think it's a decently impressive one. Again, I think Matt does very good work in getting alongside George. He makes this final 2 with Jerry. He gets Jerry to convince George to keep him around as a final 3, and I think all that is very good play for Matt. However, again, I do think there's equally bad play, especially in terms of jury perception, where he doesn't really do much throughout the middle portions of that game, where he is largely being looked at as a follower for George. But also even beyond that, I do think his flip against the Heroes is one that was just terrible for his jury management, one that made the Heroes upset that he flipped against them, but also to them, they don't really see the reason why. I mean, I think to them, it comes off as, oh, he's being manipulated by George into flipping against us, when in reality, he had his own agency the entire time, but was just not able to really articulate that. And really, I think that's what it is with Matt's game. I do think Matt had a clear-cut strategy the entire time, and one that could have potentially been a winning strategy, but was never able to make other people aware of that strategy. But I do think Matt is still a solid player here, but one that just simply didn't seem to have that much respect from the jury. And with that, let's get on to the actual winner in Liz, who, again, I think it played a pretty solid game as well. I do think Liz played a very strong first half of the game. I think the fact that she was pretty much in a central position alongside Shawnee on the original Villains Tribe is very impressive. And despite being swap screwed, she's in a position where she's able to be a part of this, what would have been Haley blindside. Now, beyond that, she does have a lot of agency in the game, though I will say that she probably makes the wrong moves with that agency, and the fact of her wanting to keep Flick around around, and her not listening to George at moments where George clearly had their best interest in mind, but George still did end up accommodating his game for Liz, and I do think there is still merit to be made for that. Now, obviously, the Liz blindside's a knock against her game, the fact that she was left out of that, though at the same time, I feel like she does pretty impressive work in getting back with George. However, a big issue for me is the fact that she did seem to be actually loyal to George here, where we hear her talk about wanting to go to Final 2 with him, which is just insane. And it really takes for George blindsiding her again for her to finally seem to come around. I do feel like for me that is like the major knock against Liz's game, but it's still not a completely detrimental one. Like, I do think there are a lot of impressive aspects to Liz's game. I do think she's a solid middle tier winner of the show, but I feel like she is one that had potential to do more. And I feel like I'm kind of disappointed with how Liz ended up winning the game, where I feel like there was all the makings here of a top tier winning game. However, I feel like there are these moments here and there that take away from that, which ends up kind of underwhelming me as a whole, though I do think Liz is a very well-rounded player. I do think there are holes in her strategic thinking in particular, but I think she is very good socially, she's good physically, and she is a pretty solid player here, and I think her winning game, despite all the holes I have with it, is probably, the third best winning game in Australian Survivor, so at least there's that. But even beyond that, storyline-wise, again, I do feel a bit underwhelmed with a Liz win, where I do feel like Liz's story arc could have been so much more interesting, and they just simply didn't seem to take that route. It seemed like they were so much more focused on showing these veteran players, whereas early on in particular, it felt like a lot of Liz's content was essentially Shawnee's content. It felt like Shawnee was essentially the vessel to tell Liz's story, and once Liz had an actual story of her own, she was still greatly overshadowed by the likes of George, and even like Nina, Simon, and even Matt by that point. And it isn't until like the tail end here that we finally get her actual revenge story, but I just feel like her story could have been so much more interesting, and I'm kind of underwhelmed by that aspect of it as well. Even though at the end of the day, again, like I think this is a passable ending to the season. I think Liz is a solid player, but I just think there are like things about it that come off as a bit disappointing, despite me thinking the season as a whole is still really great. But there we go. I mean, that's the entire season of Australian Survivor, Heroes versus Villains, which again, I think is still for sure the best Australian Survivor season. Well, again, there's still issues here. That's every Australian Survivor season. I don't think there is an Australian Survivor season that doesn't have massive issues within it. And Heroes versus Villains here, I think really minimizes a lot of that. I think its storytelling, despite being uneven, was still very solid. I think this season had some of the most notable long-term storylines in the history of Australian Survivor. And I really feel like editing was a bit more balanced. Now, while the confessional count wasn't really representative of that, and George obviously was a massive outlier in things, I do feel like we still got to know this cast pretty well. I feel like despite the likes of Jerry and Liz not getting super high confessional counts, we got to know them a decent chunk just through us seeing them in their camp life scenes. And I feel like as a whole, this is a step in the right direction for Australian Survivor. And after Blood vs. Water in particular, which was a complete disaster in my mind, I do feel like this season was just genuinely fun, while also having some of the all-time great characters, some great storylines. It really had most of what I would have wanted from it, which for me keeps it as the best Australian Survivor season up to this point. But with that, those are my thoughts on Australian Survivor Heroes versus Villains. Now, like my other reviews, I will be doing a player ranking for this season coming up. Also, we're probably pretty close to the mid-season power rankings for Survivor 44 and Big Brother Canada 11, so you can expect videos on those pretty soon as well. Also, for Australian Survivor, at some point before next season, I would like to get around to redoing my Australian Survivor Top 10 Players of All Time video, as last time I did it was immediately after All-Stars, and I feel like we have a lot of adjustments to be making to the list, so I would like to do that video at some point down the road as well. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.